the most haunted locations from around the world. I've touched on a lot of creepy things so far in this channel. Serial killers, mythical creatures, folklore, SCPs, but I've never discussed ghosts directly. But today, that changes, and I'm gonna answer all your questions about these haunted locations. Like, how did it become haunted? What ghostly encounters have been recorded? And are these places even really haunted? The year is 1835. And you have just been invited to a beautiful Christmas get-together at one of your friends' manors in the English countryside. The manor was just absolutely beautiful, and this party was packed with notable people, respected colonels, wealthy businessmen, and high-ranking government officials. The night consisted of seemingly endless food and drinks and music, and everything was just so perfect. Late into the night, once the party started to die down, you and a group of friends decided that it was time to go to bed, and you all went your own separate ways to get to your bedrooms. You turn down a hallway and you're finally by yourself and only steps away from your bedroom, when you notice down this hallway there's this woman, a woman that was wearing only brown clothing. You didn't recognize this woman from the party, but this isn't your house, and you didn't know everybody at this party, so you figured it was somebody else also going to their room. This woman was slightly notable due to the apparel that she was wearing, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and you continued to your room and had a good night's rest. You woke up the following morning on Christmas Eve and engaged in the morning festivities. The party was still not done. There was a huge brunch being served, and you and everybody else were not going to miss it. You sit down at a table with some of your friends, one of which being a colonel, and he mentions that last night he saw a rather peculiar woman. Another person at your table asks, what did she look like? And the colonel goes on to explain that on his way to his bedroom, he saw a woman dressed exclusively in brown robes. These robes were dated and tattered and had to have been at least from the previous century. It didn't look right at all. And the colonel was concerned because this woman might have been somebody who either snuck into the manor or was somebody who was obviously lost. But the colonel mentioned once he spotted this woman and walked closer to her and then tried approaching her, he realized this woman had turned around and he got a look at her face. And that's when he claimed that he saw this woman's bright white face with empty eye sockets, and the man was terrified. He didn't scream or run away, but he quickly made his way to his room without asking any more questions. Instantly, your heart dropped to your stomach because you also saw the same woman, but you didn't see her face. And before you could say anything, another woman at the table says, I also saw a lady dressed up in brown. I didn't see her face, but she was standing in the hallway, not saying anything and not moving. And your heart and stomach only sank deeper. You noticed that the host of the party was sitting beside you, and her face was in shock. You asked her, who is this lady wearing these brown rags? And she confessed that she had absolutely no idea. The Christmas party was a formal event and everybody was dressed in their absolute best. Nobody was wearing brown, and there was nobody in the party with sunken in, missing eyeballs. The host of this party quickly stands up on her chair and started clinking a spoon on her glass, causing the conversation in the room to a silence. And the host of the party asked, did anybody see a woman in brown robes anywhere in the manor last night? And to her dismay, numerous people in this room of nearly 100 people raised their hand. The story I just told is based on a real documented encounter that happened in 1835 at a Christmas party. And this story is significant because it is the first recorded sighting of the ghost that is now known as the Brown Lady at the iconic Raynham Hall. And this isn't the only sighting that's taken place, and it's probably not even the most iconic either. And only days after this event, when the host of the party made the staff aware of all of these claims, people literally quit their jobs and never returned out of fear of encountering this strange apparition. But that's not it. There was a handful of sightings on that night in 1835, but the following year in 1836, Captain Franklin Marryat, who is actually a friend of Charles Dickens, heard tell of the legend of this brown lady in the Raynham Manor and spoke to the owner directly and requested that he stay in the most haunted room of them all so he could prove that there was no ghost at all and that this legend simply came to be because the owner of this manor wanted to keep people away from his property. And let's just say he got more than he bargained for. This captain checked into the hotel and stayed in a room that literally had a painting of the apparition hung in the room. Like I mentioned, at this point, the Brown Lady was already a local legend and a common sighting within the hotel. And for the first 2 nights of his visit, the captain had a normal experience. He was staying in a hotel and rather comically was sleeping with a loaded revolver under his pillow just in case. And it was after the second night and the beginning of the third night when everything began to change. Because on night 3, Frederick didn't get a good night's sleep at all. What he did get was a run-in with the Brown Lady. Frederick had just gotten into bed and was ready to go to sleep when he noticed something in front of his door. The door never opened, but there was obviously a shadow of some sort in front of the door blocking the path. The shadow was moving and getting bigger until Frederick realized that this shadow was exactly what he was looking for. He quickly looked at the painting on the wall and noticed that This was the brown lady, and she was in his room, and she was getting closer to him. Frederick grabs the revolver from under his pillow, points it at the apparition, and screams at the top of his lungs, "Stop! Don't come closer! I'm going to shoot!" But the brown lady grew a menacing grin and began to get closer, practically at the foot of his bed, when Frederick pulled the trigger, shot the revolver into the darkness, and the apparition disappeared. 3 hotel workers came into the room to ask what had just happened, and Frederick left the hotel and never returned. I tried to only tell one story per section, but I figured that story was kind of worth going into detail over. Over the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a plethora of other run-ins with the brown lady, which brings us to Captain Hubert C. Prevant, who not only had a run-in with the brown lady, but was able to capture a picture of her, a full-body apparition. And this photo is not only iconic to the Raynham Hall, but it's also one of the most iconic photos in all of ghost hunting. This photo was taken in 1936, and since this photo has been taken, sightings have been few and far between, although many people still believe to this day that Raynham Hall is haunted. Once again, just a crazy story, but you might be thinking, okay, sure, there's this ghost there, but who is this lady and how did she get there? And because this section's getting long, let me boil it down. According to the legend of the brown lady, the Townsend family, which was the family that owned the Raynham Manor, after numerous run-ins with this apparition, was able to identify her from one of the paintings that was displayed within the manor. The woman was named Dorothy Walpole, who lived from 1686 to 1726, and was the sister of Robert Walpole, who is considered the first ever Prime Minister of Great Britain. She was the second wife of Charles Townshend, one of the original Townsends that owned the manor, and this man was well known for having a short temper. Allegedly, this man had caught Dorothy with another man, a lord, and as punishment, he locked her in her room in the manor, and she was never allowed to leave. She wasn't allowed to see friends, family, or even her own children. She was a prisoner in her own home until 1926, when she passed away from smallpox. Obviously, that story is upsetting both ways, because if Dorothy did cheat, then that's awful. But Charles had absolutely no right to do any of that whatsoever. If somebody cheats on you, you just break up with them. You say, hey, you get out of my manor, we're done. You don't say, hey, I'm gonna trap you in this room until you die. To this day, Raynham Hall is one of the most iconic haunted locations in all of England. But this is one of the more tame entries on the list, and we're only just getting started. It's the mid-1800s, and you are a medical doctor, Dr. Charles Finney. You live in Atchison, Kansas, and you run a successful medical operation out of your home. This home was something your family recently commissioned, and now you were both living in it and making it your place of business, at least for now. And everything was going smoothly until one night. You were in bed, exhausted after a long day, with your eyes feeling like they're each 1,000 pounds, just begging to be closed. And as you're on the verge of sleep, about to drift off, you hear a knocking at your door. This was extremely uncommon. You obviously had no appointments in the dead of night, and you had no idea who this could be. Reluctantly, you get out of bed and head to your front door. And when you open the door, you notice a woman standing there, holding her young daughter. This woman is frantic and explains that her daughter is in severe pain, and she can't walk, can't move, and she is in endless, excruciating pain coming from her abdomen. The doctor's fatigue instantly wears off, and he's back in work mode. And he invites the woman and the daughter in, and quickly takes them to his basement examination room, where he's able to identify the likely source of all of this pain, an inflamed appendix that was about to burst. The doctor informed the mother that this young girl needed emergency surgery now, and the mother agreed, saying, please, anything to save my daughter. The doctor quickly prepped the location, washed his hands, grabbed his tools, and then began to administer the anesthesia. Once everything was ready and the medicine was administered, the doctor hastily made the first incision. Although little did he know, the anesthesia that he had administered was an improper dose, and this girl, who was already in pain, was now in even more pain, as she could feel everything. And this incision that the doctor had just made was the final straw. Her body went into shock, and not long after, she passed away on that operating table. That young girl's name was Sally, and this story is the reason why this location is known as the Sally House. First thing I'm going to say right off the bat is, as interesting as that story is, there is absolutely no recorded evidence for that story actually being true. And it's largely regarded as a folktale, loosely based in reality. Dr. Charles Finney was a real doctor, and he worked in Atchison, Kansas, and he lived out of his practice that his family had recently commissioned. That all is true. But as far as the story of Sally is concerned, there was no physical evidence. But the reason I mention the story is because it is the story that is most associated with this haunted location. And this haunted location is one of the most iconic in all of the United States of America. So yeah, I wanted to make that distinction primarily because I knew if I didn't, others would say that's not actually true, and well, it's not proven either way, but it is highly debated and not proven that it did happen, so I'll let you make up your mind on that. That story is upsetting and sad, but what does it have to do with haunted locations? Well, that story is kind of where everything began, because after this incident that may or may not have happened in the late 1800s, experiences in the Sally House have been vast and plentiful. Some experiences only consist of hearing a creak or faint footsteps, or even the giggle of a young girl. But other encounters are a lot more sinister, with items being thrown, loud screams being heard, and even visitors being scratched to the point of bleeding. Nearly every former tenant or owner of the Sally house that had been interviewed alleged to have experienced paranormal activity of some sort, typically with consistent attributes across all of the accounts, with some even claiming to see Sally in the window at night when it was known that nobody was home. If you're watching this video, you're probably into the paranormal, which means you've probably seen some of your favorite ghost YouTubers stay in this house. Sam and Colby, Nick and Ryan, Exploring with Josh, or even large-scale TV productions. All of these people have stayed in the Sally house and had unique experiences. So for that reason, I'm not going to go too much more into detail. But I will say this, the Sally house hasn't been anybody's personal residence since the 1990s, and in more recent times has been a popular tourist attraction, which kind of makes you think, is the legend of the Sally house real? Or do people just want to keep the story alive because there's a financial incentive? Regardless, the Sally house is regarded as one of the most iconic haunted locations in the United States. The year is 1885. You and your wife are pioneers in New South Wales, Australia, and you have just finished building a double-story late Victorian-style manor on the top of a hill overlooking your local town. This was you and your wife's dream homestead, and you built it with your very own hands. The construction was a labor of love, and now you could enjoy this manor for the rest of your life. This manor became known as the Monte Cristo homestead, and you and your wife enjoyed it up until your deaths. After you and your wife were long gone and your family had no longer lived in the residence, the house essentially was left abandoned. There were caretakers, but unfortunately, the Monte Cristo homestead fell into disrepair. That was until it was purchased by another couple, Reg and Olive Ryan, and they were dedicated to building this beautiful manor back to its former glory, and that's exactly what they did. They took it from a derelict, abandoned home to something that was actually habitable. And once again, the homestead was a home again. And it wasn't long after Reg and Olive moved in that things began to get weird. One late night, only a few days after the Ryans had officially moved in, they were heading home after an event, when they noticed that as they approached their house, they could see bright lights beaming from inside the house, illuminating all of the windows. This caught Reg and Olive's attention, and they were both speechless at what they were looking at. Reg knew that the electricity wasn't even fully finished in the house yet, and for the places that did have electricity, he knew he left no lights on and no lamps burning. Olive was just in sheer terror, and the couple stopped halfway up their driveway in pure awe of what they were looking at. Their home illuminated in the middle of the night for no reason at all. Terrified, the couple approached the house, and the closer they got, the dimmer the lights got. And by the time they actually reached their new home, the house wasn't illuminated at all, and it was as dark as it should have been. The couple theorized that maybe they were just seeing the reflections of the headlight of their vehicle, but deep down they knew that wasn't what they saw at all. And this was only the beginning of the strange encounters that were going to take place over the next few years. Following this event, when the family decided to bring their family cat to their new home, instantly the cat was uncomfortable, which is common. This cat's in a new environment and was just in a car ride, something it didn't enjoy. But as soon as your wife put the cat on the floor, it arched its back and moaned in fear as if it was face to face with another cat. There was nothing there. The cat hissed and screamed and immediately ran out of the house. You, your wife, and your 3 daughters looked for the cat and never found your cat again. Following that event, there was numerous occasions where your daughters claimed that they could see a man's face out the window, which was impossible considering that all of your daughters had bedrooms on the 2nd floor, and there was never any unknown men near or around the property. The family frequently encountered disembodied voices and footsteps and noises, doors opening and drawers closing, and there was truly no explanation for any of it. After years of alleged strange and ghostly encounters, the homestead was converted into a museum, where it showcased antiques, local treasures, and became a tourist attraction with a gift shop, and became known as Australia's most haunted house. Since then, it was featured in numerous TV shows in the 70s, 90s, and early 2000s and 2010s. But very recently, in January of 2025, the homestead was actually closed to the public as Olive Ryan passed away. The Monte Cristo homestead is likely one of the most famous haunted houses in all of Australia. And whether or not the paranormal experiences actually happened to Reg and Olive, or if they just made up stories to have a way to make money off of the house they just restored, I'll let you decide. The year is 1907, and the Dutch have just finished building a beautiful office building for their railway developments in Indonesia. Why the Dutch had a rail company and headquarters in Indonesia is a different conversation. But regardless, this building existed, and it looks really cool, and operated until 1942. That's because the Japanese invaded Indonesia, and they wanted everything, including this beautiful office building. You might be asking yourself, did the Japanese just use it as their office building? Now it's their headquarters in Indonesia? And the answer is no, because once they had total control of this building, they turned an entire wing of the building into a dungeon, specifically for torture and executions, something that wasn't uncommon for the Japanese in World War II. From 1942 until 1945, the building was under Japanese control, until Dutch forces tried to overtake the building from the Japanese. And in October of 1945, a battle took place within the building from Dutch troops who entered through a tunnel underground. Although the Dutch weren't only fighting the Japanese, they were also fighting the Indonesians. And the battle lasted 3 days, and the Dutch eventually retreated. Once World War II ended, the Indonesian army took control of the complex, and it was restored and given back to the Indonesian Railway Company, not the Dutch Railway Company. And in 1992, it was officially considered cultural property of Indonesia. From 1992 until 2009, this building was essentially left to rot, and over this time, it was vandalized, and nature had begun to take it back, with mold growing, parts of the building collapsing and falling apart, and locals beginning to have interesting stories regarding this building. This building, with quite the history, is known as Lawang Sewu, and it is considered one of the most haunted locations in all of Indonesia. Lawang Sewu is very interesting, and its history alone is something to be researched and talked about. During the time that this building was left in disarray, many local teenagers would make it a challenge to touch the building, or go near the building, or go inside the building, or even in extreme cases, stay overnight in the building. This massive building with such a dark and long history became a bit of an icon for all the wrong reasons, and everyone essentially considered it to be an evil, haunted building with dark energy and dark spirits associated with it, which kind of makes sense. Like, just imagine how dark the energy is being in a building, knowing the history. The unspeakable things that happened in this building, I could only imagine left some sort of energetic residue. Regardless, this building became very popular with thrill seekers in Indonesia. And it was over this near 20-year stretch when this building was falling apart that people had many strange encounters within the walls. Hearing voices, hearing footsteps, seeing apparitions, being scratched, being touched. All of these took place within the walls. The Indonesian government actually had plans of restoring this building, but were hesitant to do so because they feared that nobody would use or interact with the building because of the fear associated with it being haunted. But against their better judgment, they continued with the restoration project. And from 2009 to 2011, the building was restored. And in 2013, the building was officially open for tours. And currently, it's a massive hit for tourism in the region of Java, Indonesia, and sees over 1,000 visitors every single day. Now, here's the thing that's kind of interesting about this building. The government has official plans to, quote, eliminate the spooky image in order to attract more visitors, which I think is interesting because that's kind of the opposite of what most ghost house owners want, right? Like, they want to not only maintain but amplify the spooky image in order to bring in people. But I guess the difference is they are wanting to make this a historical landmark, but they are fearing that this image could scare people away, as especially in this region of the world, people are extremely superstitious when it comes to spirits. And there are plenty of locals that avoid this building entirely as they fear that going near or around this building could lead a spirit to follow you to your home and essentially bring you bad luck and negative energy. So yeah, Lawang Sewu over the last 120 years has had a very long and interesting and unfortunate history, including colonization, war, torture, executions, and other unspeakable things, I'm sure. But as the government allowed this building to sit and rot, the locals decided to have some fun and found a little bit more than fun. And today, the government has restored this building to make it a historical landmark and are doing their best to make sure that nobody talks about the whole ghost part of this building, which is kind of funny. Definitely one of the more obscure entries in this list. Before we get to the last entry on this list, I just wanted to make a quick point. Originally, this video was supposed to have 10 entries, not 5. But because it takes so long to animate the stories associated with each of these sections, I decided to just essentially cut it in half. I didn't want to sacrifice the storytelling or the information for the sake of having more entries on the list. I say this because there is a ton of other crazy, obscure haunted locations that I want to talk about. So consider this video a part 1, and if you guys want that second part, leave a like or leave a comment and I will post another video about the craziest and most obscure haunted locations from around the world. Now, back to the final entry of this list. The year is 1776. You are a healthy adult man living in Venice, Italy. You have a beautiful wife and a newborn son, and unfortunately you are experiencing the harsh wrath of the plague. It's killed numerous friends and family members of yours, but fortunately you, your wife, and your son are safe. for now at least, because you have to work every single day to be able to afford to live. Your family depends on you, and you try to be as safe as possible. That is, until you catch the plague. At this point in time, the government had a protocol for anybody who had caught the plague. And your fate was to be sent to the island of Poveglia, an island that at this point the Italian government was using solely as a quarantine station for those with the plague and other diseases. And that is where you went. You weren't able to say goodbye to your wife or son as it would pose too much risk to them. And you felt confident that if you went to this island, you would quarantine and come back a healthy man and return to your family. But unfortunately, almost as soon as you were shipped to this island, you were never heard from again. Your son was able to grow up through the plague and survive it. As time went on, the plague began to go away. Things began to change. One of the bigger changes that happened was the Italian government was no longer using Poveglia as a quarantine station, but as a remote mental institution. And unfortunately, your son, through the trauma that he experienced growing up in the plague, losing his father, and other hardships that he had in his life, found himself also on the island of Poveglia. This time, not because of the plague, but because of a mental disorder that was at the time not understood. The island of Poveglia at this point had claimed the lives of multiple generations in your family. But sadly, this wasn't unique to your family. Tens of thousands of people had perished on Poveglia Island. And it's because of that dark and death-filled history that Poveglia Island is regarded as not only one of the most haunted locations in Italy, but one of the most haunted locations in the entire world. From the late 1300s until the late 1900s, this small island was inhabited by people and used for multiple different reasons. The two primary reasons, the quarantine station and the mental asylum. There was likely an unspeakable amount of atrocities that took place on this island, and it's for that reason that after it was abandoned, people gained quite the interest in visiting it. The mental hospital was the last official use of this island, but when that institution closed in 1968, not only the building went abandoned, but the entire island became abandoned, leaving the buildings, the belongings, and the history to marinate. But it didn't take long for history buffs and thrill seekers to check it out for themselves. And that's when the legend began to grow of how haunted Poveglia Island really was. I've actually watched a video of somebody not doing a ghost hunt here, but just exploring the island. I believe it was Exploring with Josh I watched, and it's kind of unfortunate because although the history of this island is rather dark, the architecture is still beautiful, and the island itself is really unique. I could only imagine it would be a cool tourist attraction, kind of like the Italian version of Alcatraz. You know how that had a really dark history but became a popular tourist attraction. Even though this entire island has been off limits from the day it closed to today, it's not stopped people from going. And it appears that almost everybody who has gone there has come back with a story, which has led to numerous different paranormal TV shows and even paranormal YouTubers to explore the island for themselves. There are no real famous notable claims of hauntings or specific apparitions on this island. There is just a general consensus among people who have been there that there is no doubt that this island is haunted, which they back up with the history of the building itself. This is definitely an example of a haunted location that I'd be more willing to take seriously simply because there's no financial incentive. This isn't something that somebody owns. Nobody's really gonna make money off of making a legend out of this. It is an abandoned building with a dark history that I'm sure the Italian government just wanted to kind of decay into nothingness. The most diabolical human experiments ever performed. The child and the ape experiment. Have you ever seen those cute videos of, new families, a young couple and they have a baby and they have a puppy and the puppy and the baby are playing together? Yeah, the ape and the child experiment is basically the worst possible version of that. This experiment takes place in 1931. It was conducted by a young couple, Winthrop and Luella Kellogg, and they recently just had a baby boy named Donald. And when Donald turned 10 months old, he had another sibling, not a brother, but a sister. However, this sister was not biological or even related by species. This sister that he was given was a 7-month-old chimpanzee named Gua. Winthrop Kellogg was a psychologist who specifically worked on the psychology of animals, primarily dolphins, rats, and birds. And him and his wife decided that it would be best to take their work home and to up the ante by not only experimenting with a chimpanzee, but also by effect their own child. The couple planned on documenting this entire experiment that they were about to begin. And the specific point of this experiment was to study the environmental influence upon early behavior, which what that really meant was they wanted to see if they raised a baby and an ape the exact same way at the exact same time, if they could get a similar outcome. And you can probably already see where this is going. It's speculated that they initially thought that this experiment would be relatively harmless and that their child would simply be a baseline to refer to when it comes to early education. And only the chimpanzee would be tested on because only the chimpanzee was being treated differently, right? The child hanging out with a chimpanzee wasn't going to be affected by this. Well, I won't spoil it, but it wasn't fully accurate. Interestingly, the Kellogg's thought they were doing the moral thing because initially they actually wanted to test the opposite. They wanted to see what the effects of having a child grow up in the wild would be. But because it's extremely dangerous and unethical to leave a baby in the woods, they're like, oh, well, why don't we just take an animal and put it in a human condition to see exactly how smart a chimpanzee can be and what their true natural potential would be if they were raised as a human. When you put it in that perspective, it may almost kind of seem logical, right? Regardless, after Donald and Gua were introduced, the tests began. And over the next 9 months, there was full-time grueling tests taking place between Gua and Donald to see exactly how a baby chimp and a baby human would compare and develop as they were both being treated the exact same as a normal baby would. Although, was Donald really being treated like a normal baby? They likely never had the time to ask that question because over these 9 months, there were so many experiments, tests, practices. There was literally no time to think about anything besides the daily tasks. Winthrop, during this time, literally took a leave of absence from his job to focus on this experiment full time and even moved his family down to Florida to be closer to the university where he had gotten this chimp and where he would be submitting his research. Now, after 9 months of daily testing and analysis, the experiment was mysteriously stopped. And while almost every aspect of this experiment was relatively well documented, the reason for why it stopped was not, which led to a bit of speculation. One primary belief is that they ended the experiment due to the rapid growth of Gua compared to Donald. Obviously, animals develop a lot faster than humans do, and in 9 months, Gua could have doubled or tripled in size, making her possibly dangerous to baby Donald. However, another leading theory is due to the fact that Donald was picking up more chimpanzee tendencies than the Kellogg's would have liked. And this is supported by some of the documents that the Kellogg's made. They even admitted near the end of the test that Donald was behind when it came to communication, and really only had a very small vocabulary of words and wasn't babbling much, and typically would only mimic the noises that Gua would make. Regardless of the reason, after 9 months, the experiment was closed. And while the experiment was well documented and completed at this point, the story doesn't end there. Because unfortunately, only a year after Gua was returned to the facility that she was taken from, she passed away from pneumonia. And Donald, on the other hand, was reported to have suffered from social and emotional issues through his young and adult life, and even ended up taking his own life at the age of 43. At this point, with the experiment basically being almost 100 years old, it's kind of up to speculation to try to understand if the parents knew that Donald would simply be a control for this test that they were doing, or if they knew that this experiment could potentially have detrimental side effects to their own child. But regardless, it happened, and now we know the consequences. And unsurprisingly, the ethics of this experiment were widely criticized, specifically because they used their own human child in such a strange and long-lasting experiment. And while some of the findings from this experiment did end up becoming useful in scientific research of animals and humans, one has to ask themselves, is it worth experimenting on your own child? Is it worth experimenting on any human? Is it worth experimenting on animals? That's a question I'll leave to you. Regardless, the child and the ape experiment is rather unfortunate. And if you can believe it, this is the most tame human experiment we're going to discuss in this list. They only get worse from here, and we're only just getting started. Let's move on. The Little Albert experiment. In the first experiment, we discussed a child who was not given the proper opportunity to develop like a normal child should, and unfortunately, they became a victim of that. Although in this experiment, we do discuss another child. However, they weren't just not given the opportunity to develop, they were forced to develop negative connections in their brain. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but this is literally a Pavlov experiment that took place on children, not dogs. Let me explain. The Little Albert experiment was conducted by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner and took place in 1920. And the point of the Little Albert experiment was to see if they could condition children to fear something that would typically not provoke fear. Already off to a great start. Watson famously claimed that if he was given 12 newborn children, he could condition them in their upbringing to turn them into any sort of person you could desire. A lawyer, a doctor, a murderer. Anything you wanted a person to be, you could condition them to become that during their early years. I definitely do not think we should be giving John B. Watson any children. Regardless, in the 1920s, somebody did. Watson was able to get his hands on a 9-month-old baby, known as Albert, for his experiment. Watson planned on using classical conditioning methods, also known as Pavlovian conditioning, because it was the same method that Pavlov used to condition dogs. The experiment began with little Albert being placed in a room. Watson, his partner, and a rat were all in this room together, and Watson and his partner simply watched how Albert and the rat would interact. At first, they weren't interested in each other until Albert decided to reach out and touch the white lab rat. It was at that point when Rosalie would strike a metal bar with a hammer, making a loud and scary noise, which would obviously upset Albert. And they would continue to do this time after time in this room every time Albert decided to reach out to the lab rat, until the point where Albert wanted nothing to do with this lab rat. Albert had associated this lab rat with a scary, unpleasant experience. And because of that, this lab rat that he was curious about, he was now afraid of. And not only now was this little Albert afraid of mice, but his fear began to become generalized. They learned this because after the experiment, when they handed Albert a teddy bear, Albert also rejected and gave the same reaction to this fluffy teddy bear that he did to the mouse. And it was theorized that at that point, it wasn't only the mouse that was triggering this negative reaction, but it was any fuzzy object that resembled the white mouse to this baby. Some examples were a white teddy bear, a white rabbit, a small dog, and even a Santa Claus mask. Fortunately, this specific experiment only had one victim, and that was little Albert. There was no control subjects, and the study basically ended there and the paper was published. And while that alone has obvious ethical flaws, once again, the story does not end there. Because Watson was now able to prove that he could condition a child, so what did he do next? Well, naturally, he decided to condition his own children. But he didn't condition his children for fear, but he did have some very interesting parenting philosophies. One of his most popular parenting philosophies was the thought that children should not be given too much attention. Watson believed that you should limit the amount of affection you showed your children. That meant during the day, limiting hugs, no kisses, minimal affirmation, and minimal attention. He literally said that you shouldn't play with your kids because it would disrupt their routine, as if children have routines. He also was a big proponent of sleep training, basically just letting your baby lay in the crib until it cries itself to sleep. Watson believed in all of this, and because he believed this and believed it to be good, he used all of these strategies on his 4 children that he had. Keep in mind, Watson claimed that if he was given newborn children, he could turn them into anything he wanted. So what do you think ended up happening to his 4 children? Let me tell you. Watson's son John suffered from unexplainable migraines and died in his early 50s. His daughter Mary struggled with alcohol abuse almost all of her adult life and attempted to take her life multiple times. Watson's other son James also attempted to take his life, and Watson's 4th child William did take his own life. Candidly, I'm not a parent, but I think it's safe to assume, based off this example and possible common sense, providing your children with a safe, loving environment is likely ideal for them to be raised into happy, healthy people. But what do I know? If you're a parent and you're watching this, let me know your thoughts on this experiment in the comments below. Regardless, the true identity of little Albert was never disclosed. It's unknown whether or not the parents of little Albert knew about the experiment. The long-term effects of this experiment that took place on little Albert are unknown and unfortunately are likely not good based off of the evidence we've seen. And Watson not only unsuccessfully raised his own children, but also influenced an entire generation on how to raise their children, which likely had an interesting impact on society. I think it's important to know that near the end of his life, Watson became rather reclusive and began to denounce a lot of his previous work, stating that he should have not made the books he did or made the claims that he had simply because he didn't have the knowledge yet. And it's even reported that he burned a lot of the physical copies of his experiments that he had in his personal study. You always want to assume the best in people, and maybe Watson just thought that if you gave your children too much affection, they would simply be attention-seeking, unhappy people. And for that reason, if that is truly the case, then it's unfortunate that he made such a detrimental mistake with those that likely meant the most to him. Although there is a very likely possibility that this person simply didn't care about the well-being of people and only wanted the scientific answer he was looking for. I know these entries were a bit similar, and for that reason, I wanted to put them together. Truthfully, I couldn't pick just one to add, so I decided to add both. And because this video gets darker and darker, they obviously had to go side by side. And if you're done hearing about childhood experiments, then buckle up, because this video is about to take a very dark turn. The Aversion Project. If you've watched our first video we made about conspiracy theories, then you'd probably remember me talking about the Canadian gaydar, which was essentially tests that the Canadian government developed to ensure that nobody in the military or police was gay, because if they were, then they were being fired. The Aversion Project was kind of like that, but only unthinkably worse. Like much, much, much worse. The Aversion Project took place in South Africa during the 1970s and 1980s, under the apartheid regime. This entire project was led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, who was a military psychiatrist. And under his control, this entire project was actually carried out by the South African Defense Force, a massive military institution in South Africa. And in the South African military, there was actually a dual policy, which essentially stated that permanent members of the military were not able to be homosexual. You couldn't be gay if you were gonna stay. However, conscripts and temporary members of the military were allowed to be gay. But this isn't because they were a kind and tolerant bunch. The primary reason why this dual policy existed is because the South African military wanted to make sure that nobody was using homosexuality as an excuse to not join the army, which would have likely been very common because at the time, all white men in South Africa were required to serve a certain amount of years in the military. And the government thought if they banned homosexuality, obviously, then all these white men would just be claiming they're gay. Now here's the thing, it doesn't end there. The South African military might have allowed temporary members of the military to, join, as they were legally required to, but another thing they had to do if they were a temporary member of the military who was homosexual is they had to endure forced therapy. And of course, this wasn't talk therapy or to help people suffering from PTSD in the military. This was forced aversion therapy with electric shocks, castration, and even gender reassignment surgeries. The project's ultimate goal was to cure these homosexual military members while they were a member of the military and basically at the will of the military. And because of that, they forced them through psychological torture and medical procedures that they did not want to have done. And on top of this, they didn't just do this to people that admitted they were homosexual. They did this to people that they assumed were homosexual. Meaning that if you were a member of the military at this time and people thought that you were being a bit fruity, or if people just didn't like you and wanted a good excuse to literally torture you, they would accuse you of being gay. And at that point, you could be subject to a laundry list of horrific experiments. Some of the most common things that were done were strapping down these alleged homosexuals and showing them homosexual images. Obviously, it doesn't end there. As they would show these victims homosexual images, they would then electrically shock the victim to try to create a negative connection in the brain towards same-sex relationships, which kind of ties into the Little Albert experiment. Which, on top of this shock therapy, some soldiers were chemically castrated by being given a concoction of chemicals that the doctors believed could potentially cure homosexuality, or at least all of their evil urges. And one less popular thing they did that still happened was forced gender reassignment surgeries, where these members of the military were literally subject to hormonal treatments and genital surgeries that would alter their sex against their will, which is disturbing and evil and almost ironic because they're like, okay, we're gonna take all of the gay people of the military, so we're gonna make them trans. Literally just insane. And it's estimated that anywhere from 500 to 1,000 young men and women were subject to these brutal procedures at the hands of the Aversion Project over the course of the apartheid. It's hard to imagine the sheer terror and agony that was likely being experienced by the victims at this time, but it's even harder to imagine the long-term effects of this essentially torture that took place on these people. There's no doubt that many of the victims that suffered this severe psychological and physical trauma had the rest of their lives altered forever. And specifically for the people that had their genitals mutilated unconsensually, for the percentage of those who survived the surgery, many of them went on to take their own life not long after. The apartheid ended in the 1990s, and the truly disturbing details of the Aversion Project came to light. And Dr. Levin knew he was about to be in big trouble, so he left South Africa and fled to Canada, where he, disturbingly, was able to continue his medical practice. That was until he ironically was convicted of multiple sexual assaults on men. That's right, this person who had been mutilating homosexual and suspected homosexual men and women in South Africa himself was accused by over 30 men of sexual assault. And it was only at that point, after Levin was tried, that he was sentenced to 5 years, which he had already served and he's actually free again, and had his medical license suspended. This story and series of human experiments is truly diabolical. And on top of all of the pain and suffering and discrimination that took place in the South African military, it's almost mind-boggling to me that if Levin didn't assault people in Canada, he would be a free man, and that he served no time or had no legal repercussion for what he did in South Africa. However, I suppose logically it makes sense because in South Africa, what they were doing was legal. That was the law. If you were gay, you had to go to the military and you had to be cured, or at least treated. So crazy. But at least the story has a bit of a happy ending because evil people are gonna be evil. And while Levin had a get out of jail free card by going back to Canada, he couldn't go at least a few days without hurting other people. 5 years for over 30 assaults of literal medical patients is not enough in my opinion. The Aversion Project is truly a dark chapter in medical and human rights history. And to this day, the story is a huge reminder of what's possible when you have unchecked power, non-existent morals, and state-backed medical abuse. Before we get to the final entry of this video, I wanted to list a few honorable mentions, or I suppose dishonorable mentions. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was a truly diabolical human experiment, and if you want to learn about that, I actually talked about it in this video about American conspiracy theories. The monster study of 1939, I actually talked about in my first video about human experiments, and the Unit 731 experiment is likely one of the most diabolical human experiments to ever take place. And the only reason why it's not in this video is because I also talked about it in my last video. So I just wanted to address these quickly. Obviously, these are all diabolical human experiments. I'm just not talking about them in this video because I've already mentioned them in other videos. And while we're at it, I just want to say this as well. If you guys enjoyed this video about diabolical human experiments and want more, please let me know in the comments below. Your guys' support is always appreciated, and your feedback is always taken into consideration. But truthfully, I'm just procrastinating at this point because this final entry on the list is literally beyond diabolical. But I suppose let's just rip off the band-aid now. The Nazi medical experiments. This experiment isn't one experiment. It's an entire series of experiments that took place during World War II. And these Nazi medical experiments were carried out in concentration camps under the direction of high-ranking Nazi doctors, primarily Joseph Mengele, who was later known as the Angel of Death. There's a reason why I put this one last. It's important to note that Joseph Mengele was not the only doctor committing these atrocities we're about to get into. There was over a dozen doctors committing horrible human rights violations, and doing so in the name of science, but as you'll see, it's quite far from the truth. Joseph Mengele and the other Nazi doctors performed their experiments on prisoners in the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, which primarily housed Jewish and Romani people. And because the people in these camps were not even seen as humans, to the Nazis, they were essentially less than cattle, and the fact that they were coming in by the trainload every day meant that these doctors had an unlimited supply of research subjects that they could do anything they wanted to. And they took full advantage of this cruel, horrific opportunity. The reasons for these experiments varied greatly, from experimenting on people for the benefit of the military, all the way to personal leisure or interest. There was literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different experiments that were performed on these people by the Nazis to gain random pieces of knowledge. I literally can't explain every single one of them, although I will give a few examples of some of the things they did. One disturbing experiment that the Nazi Party did was they would take someone and then put them into a pressure chamber. A chamber that they could either add air pressure to or remove air pressure from to simulate altitude. And what they would do with these victims in the chamber is raise and drop the pressure significantly multiple times. And the reason they were doing this is to see the effects on the human body of quick altitude changes to further their research on what happens when people jump out of planes. Obviously an advantageous military strategy. The experience for the victim inside the chamber had to be horrific. And unfortunately, after cycles of high and low pressure, the doctors would then take these victims and autopsy them while they were still alive, because they wanted to monitor every part of the body while the heart was still beating. They did this one specific diabolical experiment to over 200 people, 80 of which died during the experiment, and the other 120 that survived were executed immediately after. Another disturbing human experiment the Nazis would do involved hyperthermia. They wanted to better understand how it worked and how to prevent it. And how they went about this was by subjecting people to intense conditions. For some examples, they would put people naked into freezing water, monitoring their vitals until they died of hypothermia. Other examples, they would put people in Nazi uniforms and then put them into cold water to see how effective the Nazi uniforms were at preventing hypothermia. And in some cases, they would put people naked in freezing conditions for up to 14 hours to see what would happen to these people. And for those who did survive the intense cold conditions, they would rewarm these people and then subject them to crazy conditions once again. And how they would rewarm these people varied from heat lamps to boiling water. Similar to the Unit 731 experiment, they also tested diseases, specifically injecting deadly diseases into people to see how they would affect them, and also performing live autopsies on these people so they could see the effects of the disease in real time. Almost all of the surgeries and experiments that were performed by the Nazis were performed without anesthesia, meaning that these victims felt almost every grueling detail of what was happening to them, whether it be a live autopsy or being boiled alive or having an experimental sterilization take place on on your genitals. I think you get the point, but these Nazi medical experiments were insane. Joseph Mengele personally conducted experiments specifically on twins too, with some of the more common experiments having the goal of either changing eye colors or conjoining siblings by simply removing limbs and trying to connect the two people together. Like I said, I would need probably a multi-day long video to go through the entire list of crazy experiments that took place, but at the end of the day, the total goal of all of these Nazi medical experiments lined up basically with the Nazis' radical ideologies that they had. And the purpose of these experiments was to simply improve the survival chances of German soldiers at war and to find the most effective way to sterilize or exterminate people that weren't Aryan. I could go deeper into excruciating detail, but I truly think you get the idea. The experiments performed by these Nazi medical doctors were so detrimental and so well known that it forced these doctors to be tried during the Nuremberg trials, which individually varied in level of consequences, but in general led to a much stricter medical standard, including the Nuremberg Code, which is essentially a set of ethical principles that must be followed when conducting human experimentation. The Nazi medical experiments were almost unspeakably disturbing, and I can only imagine the acts that didn't make it to the history books. And these human experiments that took place by the Nazis are likely only rivaled by the Unit 731 experiment for some of the most diabolical human experiments of all time. And for that reason, I knew I had to discuss it on this video. This video went from strange to upsetting to disgusting to disturbing extremely quick. But don't say I didn't warn you. It's almost mind-boggling the lengths that people are willing to go to in the name of scientific discovery. And while that almost may sound noble out of context, I think that this video, if nothing else, proved that there is a line and rules need to be enforced. How the most notorious serial killers were caught. The year is 1888, and you are located in Whitechapel, England, one of the roughest areas in London's East End. You, like most of the people in your life and in Whitechapel, don't live a life of luxury at all. You struggle to make ends meet, and tonight don't even have the 2 pence to pay for a place to sleep. You used to have a more or less picturesque life until your husband died, and since being on your own, like many women at the time, you resorted to selling your body. Whitechapel wasn't a booming metropolitan area, but it did contain over 62 brothels and over 1,200 prostitutes at the time. So to you, it was a better option than starving. With nowhere else to go, you spent the last few hours at the pub you frequented, and as the pub began to close, the bartender sensed that you weren't able to pay your bill. Unfortunately, they told you tonight it was on the house, as they knew you had fallen onto some tough times. You stumble out of this bar, beyond drunk, into the dark labyrinth that is the Whitechapel streets, and you begin to take the long and ominous walk home. At this time, it had to be at least 2 or 3 in the morning. The street was so dimly lit and the fog was so thick, you could barely see a person standing a few feet in front of you. Luckily, the labyrinth of small roads was something you were more than familiar with and could do with your eyes closed. And while there was nobody on this street beside yourself, you do notice a figure in the distance. Something that you knew wasn't typically there. It wasn't a lamppost, and it wasn't an animal. As you get closer, you realize that it's a man in a dark trench coat and tall hat. As your drunken thoughts begin to process what you're looking at, you realize that this man was your golden ticket. You had just possibly found a place to stay tonight and even a way to make a few dollars. And as you approach this man, you try to put yourself together and approach him confidently. You walk right up to him and tell him that if he's looking for a good time, you can both go back to his place, and before you could even finish your offer, you slowly notice this man developing an unnatural smirk. And before you're even fully able to process this unnerving smile, you notice something. The reflection of what streetlight was available twinkled off of an object that this man just pulled out of his pocket, although it wasn't a pocket watch or change. This man had just pulled out a 7-inch knife. You instantly realize you need to run away as soon as possible, but your alcohol-induced delayed reaction time prevented you from taking any action, and the only thing you could do was let out a gasp before this man raises the knife and cuts your existence short. Only a few hours later, at the very crack of dawn, a man is slowly venturing down a cobblestone road when he sees something on the sidewalk. He notices a woman on the sidewalk. Although this wasn't the typical Whitechapel homeless person. This was a woman face down, surrounded by blood. This man instantly gets out of his buggy, flips this woman over, only to realize that this woman was not only injured, but brutally murdered. Her neck was stabbed multiple times, and her torso was not only stabbed, but mutilated, with her intestines almost spilling out of her torso. This grim and disgusting discovery was one of the many victims of Jack the Ripper, and the start of a hunt for truth that would last over 137 years. There's no doubt that Jack the Ripper is one of the most notorious, if not the most notorious serial killer of all time. And of course, we're going to discuss exactly how he was caught. But before we discuss how he was caught, it's important to understand exactly how he wasn't caught so long ago. Obviously, technology wasn't nearly advanced as it was now, but that doesn't mean that crimes weren't solved. And in the case of Jack the Ripper, there was plenty of situations where Jack was very close to being caught and truthfully should have been caught, but we'll get to that. One of the biggest factors that consistently contributed to Jack the Ripper being able to go on for so long without being identified was the location of where he lived. As I mentioned earlier, Whitechapel was a rough area, and although it was tight and crowded, people weren't necessarily paying attention to others as they had enough to focus on. And weird things going on weren't so weird there. People shouting in the streets, people sleeping in the streets, people fighting, people with blood on their clothes, all weren't necessarily uncommon in a place where people were struggling to survive, dealing with disease, violence, and crime, and truthfully just trying to make it to their next meal, let alone their own next day. This gave Jack a lot of leeway to commit some truly horrendous crimes as long as he wasn't directly in anybody's eyesight. Another major contributing factor to the reason why he wasn't caught at the time is because he was only active for a few years. Obviously, being an active serial killer for any period of time is unacceptable. However, if you've seen any of our videos on serial killers, you would know that some killers are active for decades. At the time, it wasn't known how long Jack the Ripper was active, as his identity was unknown. Although, with the information that we have now, we can pinpoint exactly when he stopped killing and why he did too. But before we discuss that, let's first discuss how Jack the Ripper even earned a name as a serial killer. This brings us back to our initial story. A woman being found dead in the Whitechapel streets wasn't common, but wasn't unheard of. But what was unheard of was the sheer level of mutilation that occurred on her body. If this happened only once, there would be no Jack the Ripper. But the volume and consistency of these attacks in such a short amount of time were what fueled the media to create a monster, and one of the first ever famous serial killers. In 1888 alone, there is 5 confirmed killings associated with Jack the Ripper. These 5 victims are known as the canonical 5. And the reason these 5 victims are confirmed to be victims of Jack the Ripper are because they all exhibit trademarks of Jack's method of murder. All of these 5 women were either underprivileged, vulnerable, or had recently fallen onto hard times. And most notably, all of these victims had been murdered and brutally mutilated in such a specific manner. But it wasn't mutilation alone that created Jack the Ripper's signature murder. It was how precise and consistent these mutilations were. Coroners and doctors who inspected these victims once they were found would all remark that whoever had done this must have been experienced with a knife in some way, whether they were a doctor or a butcher or a shoemaker. And during the time that these murders were being investigated in the late 1800s, people in those exact professions, among others, were questioned, as whoever was wielding this knife and mutilating these women was no amateur. And that is beyond unsettling. As these murders were first being discovered, people believed that there was multiple murderers on the loose, as people were being killed more than ever, and these murders were happening so close to each other. And for 2 of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, they were even murdered in the same night, 45 minutes apart from each other. And for that fact, it's reasonable to assume that it might have been multiple people. However, like I mentioned, the sheer consistency of these mutilations made it hard to believe there was more than one person. And with every murder, the newspaper was feeding more and more into the story that a monster was on the loose. Obviously, the newspapers covered these strange murders to keep locals up to date on what was happening, although some speculate that the newspaper was pushing the story for ulterior motives as well. The name Jack the Ripper didn't come from the police or from the public. It was a name that was referenced in a letter that was sent to the media from somebody claiming to be the murderer. That letter, known as the Dear Boss letter, at that time and until today was considered to be a hoax. However, Jack the Ripper must have gotten word about this hoax and decided to confirm things once and for all, as shortly after the Dear Boss letter was submitted to the media, another letter was submitted to the media, known as the From Hell letter. However, this letter was more convincing, as it wasn't just a written statement from somebody claiming that they were the murderer. It was a letter that stated that it was from the murderer, and proved it by including half of a kidney in the letter. This half kidney was from one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And it was at that point when the newspaper and the general public knew that they had one deranged individual on their hands. And it was also that letter that launched Jack the Ripper from local terror to nationwide and later global infamy. Up until last year, that's basically where the story would have ended. Jack the Ripper was never caught, his identity was never known, and he was somebody that truly terrorized not only his city, but the world. That was until recently. In 2007, a self-proclaimed Jack the Ripper expert named Russell Edwards bought a shawl But it wasn't any shawl. He wasn't upgrading his wardrobe. He bought a shawl that was believed to have been owned by one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And not only that, but this shawl was also present at a murder scene and was likely to have DNA on it. And it was this purchase that led to one of the biggest cold cases being solved in almost 150 years. Edwards gave this shawl that he had purchased to a biochemist and tasked him with finding any DNA possible. And that's exactly what he did. And only a few years later, a peer-reviewed article on the DNA analysis that the biochemist was able to find was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019. The article that this biochemist published claimed exactly what Russell Edwards had written about all the way back in 2014, that Jack the Ripper was a man named Aaron Kosminski. And while this article has been criticized by scientists for making misassumptions, it does make a pretty compelling case, and at the very least provides a bit more context to the entire Jack the Ripper situation. Aaron Kosminski was born on September 11th, 1865 in Poland, but emigrated to England in the 1880s. He lived in Whitechapel in the East End of London, and his occupation was a barber or hairdresser. That alone is interesting because that confirms that Aaron Kosminski was in the area of the Jack the Ripper killings when they happened, and he also was in a profession that wasn't a stranger to sharp objects. But the information gets deeper. In 1891, Kosminski was institutionalized after he threatened his own sister with a knife. Coincidentally, 1891 was the same year that the suspected Jack the Ripper killings stopped happening. Aaron Kosminski spent the rest of his life institutionalized, and while information about his time in these sanitariums is relatively undocumented, or at least deeply archived, it is documented that he did suffer with severe schizophrenia, leaving him very troubled. Which is also interesting because the things that Jack the Ripper did would, in my opinion, only be the result of somebody who was truly disturbed. But on top of all of these similarities and coincidences, the biggest claim of the article submitted by the biochemist that Russell Edwards had commissioned was that they claimed to have a DNA link between Aaron Kosminski and DNA found on the shawl of the Jack the Ripper victim. It was actually a 100% DNA match. And that piece of evidence alone was the nail in the coffin, and what sparked a lot of the news you likely saw this year of Jack the Ripper's identity finally being revealed. Over the years, there's been a handful of interesting theories about who Jack the Ripper truly was, but I think the argument that it was Aaron Kosminski is definitely the most compelling. But with that being said, was Jack the Ripper ever truly caught? Well, if Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, then his identity was revealed, which means something. But also, if it was Aaron Kosminski, that does mean that he was institutionalized in 1891 for the rest of his life, meaning that he was imprisoned not for his crimes, but for his illness. His illness that likely sparked these crimes. So although you could argue Jack the Ripper was still not 1000% confirmed, I do think that there is a strong argument that Aaron Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. And for that reason, I do believe he was caught. But even if you don't agree, I think this story is extremely interesting. It adds, if nothing else, new layers to one of the coldest cases in serial killer history. But this is only the first case of 3 that we're covering in this video, so let me summarize. How exactly did Jack the Ripper get caught? According to the evidence we have, he got caught because he was consistently killing. He killed in a very methodical way. He confirmed he was a man acting alone in a letter he wrote to the media. And that letter not only confirmed that he was one person, but also gave the media ammo to create this spectacle that was Jack the Ripper. And it was this spectacle that got him caught. Because if the media didn't make Jack the Ripper the big boogeyman that he was, there would not be Jack the Ripper historians in the modern day. And if there was no Jack the Ripper in the modern day, there would be no collector buying this old shawl that was at the scene of the crime, and there would be nobody to give it to a biochemist to check it for DNA. And it's interesting to think, if Jack the Ripper never had written that letter, would we be talking about him today? And would he have ever been caught? I guess we'll never know. But let's move on. Saturday, August 24th, 1985. You are a 13-year-old boy, and you had just returned home to Southern California from a road trip with your family. The road trip was fun, but the entire time there was an eerie undertone, as your parents and the family you had been visiting out of town were all focused on one subject: the serial killer that had been on the loose in Southern California. You didn't know much of the situation, and truthfully, you weren't too interested, but you overheard your parents talking about some sort of night stalker. And between overhearing your parents and news coverage, it was hard not to have some sort of context about what was going on. And from what you understood, there was this crazy man on the loose who at this point had killed 13 innocent people, and was still not only not caught, but not even identified. This, to you, was scary. But what was about to happen on this fateful night was going to be a lot scarier. You return home from your family vacation later in the night, and you spent the evening unpacking, something that you delayed doing because you were watching your favorite VHS. It was a movie known as Back to the Future, and it only came out a month prior. And watching this movie kept you up later than usual, and this movie left you excited and unable to sleep, which is why you were up at midnight, which for you was later than usual. The rest of your family was sleeping, so you made sure to be quiet and keep to yourself. It was until you realized that you left your favorite pillow in the family RV, and you weren't going to bed without it, so you had to quietly sneak out to it to get it, obviously without waking your parents. You tiptoe outside, and once you make it into the yard, you hear something that sounds like footsteps, but you're not alarmed. You have a large backyard that's unfenced that backs onto a hill, and seeing possums, raccoons, and even deer weren't necessarily uncommon. And you were curious to see what was making all of this noise. You don't see any animal or anything at all, and figure whatever little critter it was must have scurried away. And since you're outside, you figured, why not go to the garage and work on your bike a little bit? Back to the Future got you inspired to tinker around, and maybe you were about to build the first time-traveling bike. And it was shortly into this tinkering session that you once again heard footsteps. But this time it was different. There was no suspicion of this being an animal. You were certain that you were hearing a person walking around the property. Your biggest fear was that your dad was coming out to see what you were up to, but what was actually outside was much more terrifying. It only took a few moments for you to realize that whoever was outside wasn't your dad, because they didn't enter the garage and they didn't say anything. You had an odd feeling and decided to hide behind the car and realized that you couldn't be here. You bolted out of the garage directly into the house, and as soon as you got into the house, you looked out the window to see exactly what was outside. And that's when you see a man walking around your home. You see this man start to walk away, and before he fully leaves your property, you want to get one last look to see if you know who this man could be and what he was doing there. And as you run from your bedroom out through the kitchen to the garage, your dad stops you in the kitchen and asks you, what are you doing? Why are you up at this hour? Hastily, you tell your dad that there's a man in the yard and you need to see who he is and what he's doing now. And after explaining this entire situation in only a matter of seconds, you shove your dad out of the way and run into the yard, when you catch a glimpse of a figure wearing a baseball cap, a jacket, and blue jeans. And although you can't identify this figure, you see them get into an orange Toyota. An orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack. As this man got into his car, you run into the road to follow him. And although his car is facing the opposite direction to you, he doesn't just drive off. He does a U-turn in the middle of the road to go the opposite direction. And this gives you the opportunity to see this man's face. The man drove off, and you, confused, go back inside and explain everything to your dad. Concerned, your dad already had the police called, and rather swiftly, the police were at the door taking a written statement. But it was only an hour later when the police called back to get even more information. And then a few hours later, at 6 in the morning, the police once again returned for more information. And the reason why the police returned at 6 in the morning was because only a mile and a half away from your home, there was another mysterious murder. And it happened only shortly after your initial report was made. And it was at that point when everything had clicked. Initially, you and your parents assumed that there must have been some sort of potential burglar lurking in the yard that was scared away when he saw that people were up. But once the police had confirmed that there was a murder only a mile from your home, they suspected that you didn't find a burglar, but that you likely came face to face with Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. 2 days later, on August 27th, 1985, the police identified a vehicle that matched the description that you had given them. It was an orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack parked on the side of the road. The police had this car towed and impounded, likely to provoke the owner to show up to reclaim it and then to be investigated. When the police towed this car, they asked you, is this the car that you saw that night? And you confirmed it. And the reason why they towed this car initially is because on the night when they took their official statement, you told them that you saw this exact car. And you even remembered the first few digits of the license plate. This alone was a huge breakthrough in the case, and was one of the major turning points that got Richard Ramirez caught. Once the vehicle was confirmed to be the one that they saw that night, police investigated the entire vehicle, finding very little evidence. That was until they found a single fingerprint on the driver's side mirror, a fingerprint that linked the driver of the vehicle to Richard Ramirez. And at that point, a photo and name was submitted to the public as a person of interest. And it was at that point when the floodgates on this case burst open. One day after the name and photo were submitted to the public, on August 31st, 1985, Richard Ramirez was trying to steal a vehicle. And while attempting to steal this vehicle, vehicle, an altercation broke out, and this altercation got the attention of neighbors. And although Ramirez was able to get car keys from a woman that he had just assaulted, before he could drive away with his vehicle he had attempted to steal, a neighbor had pulled Ramirez out of the vehicle, and other neighbors at this point had also approached the vehicle and began to beat and restrain Ramirez. The police were called, showed up, and arrested the man. And 1 week later, the police called you one final time to identify the person you saw that night in a lineup. You looked at 5 criminals standing beside each other, and you instantly recognized the man who you saw in your backyard. You tell the police that that was the man you saw that night, and it was your testimony that led to the Night Stalker being caught once and for all. The boy in the story that identified Ramirez is known as James Ramiro, and he is truly one brave young man. Not even a young man, he's like 13, he's literally a boy, like a child. And perhaps him being so naive allowed him to have the confidence and the blissful ignorance to follow a mysterious man into your backyard in the middle of the night. As a grown man, I wouldn't do that alone, even if I was armed. Regardless, James being up late that night and deciding to follow this man to the yard ultimately led to the downfall of one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, and undoubtedly saved the lives of innocent people that Richard Ramirez would have victimized next. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of all charges and was sentenced to death. His convictions specifically were 12 counts of first-degree murder, 11 counts of second-degree murder, and 14 counts of first-degree burglary. And although he was on death row, he died on June 7th, 2013 at the age of 53 of lymphoma. I think the story kind of tells itself here. James was an absolute legend of a boy, and Ramirez was a troubled excuse for a man. And although Ramirez was unfortunately able to victimize so many innocent people, justice was at least eventually served, largely in part to James. So exactly how did the Night Stalker get caught? Well, he messed with the wrong boy staying up past his bedtime. The year is 1998. You live in a small town in England known as Hyde, and you have recently been going through some distressing times with your family. Your father-in-law has been experiencing very odd medical symptoms, and it's believed that he may have cancer. Obviously, wanting the best, you and your family decide to go to one of the most respected and well-known doctors in the entire city of Hyde, a man named Harold Shipman. Your father-in-law gets an examination, and a few days later, you call him to follow up on the prognosis. The doctor on the phone rather firmly responds, "I wouldn't buy him any Easter eggs," which was a harsh way of delivering news that someone was going to die soon. Almost eerie, as Easter was only 2 weeks away. Due to the shock of the news you've just received, you appreciate him telling you the truth, and you hang up the phone and begin talking to your family. Your family took this news a little bit softer, as they believed that he was being metaphorical and almost joking, saying that the end was soon, but there was no way that it could have been this soon, right? Regardless, your family started to make the appropriate plans. And almost on cue, only 4 days later after that phone call, even earlier than the doctor had claimed, your father-in-law had passed away. The truth behind his death was a lot more disturbing than simply him succumbing to the disease he had. You meet with the doctor after your father-in-law's passing to discuss if anything could have been done and what really happened and why this was so sudden. And the doctor, rather sternly yet calmly and somewhat compassionately, described to you that sometimes things happen so fast, and realistically in situations with terminal illness, there's not much you can do. This doctor tells you that an autopsy isn't required and that you should plan the funeral as soon as possible to begin the grieving process. And like many others before you, you take his advice and opt to not have an autopsy. This practice was common for Harold Shipman, as he not only advocated for all of his patients who had family members who passed away to not only not get an autopsy, but also to get a cremation as fast as possible. But as you likely already know, these recommendations weren't coming from a place of compassion, but instead out of a place of self-preservation. And the reason why I say this is because Harold Shipman was actively killing his patients. He targeted typically elderly women and sometimes elderly men too, and for the most part victimized people who were already terminally ill and unlikely to be suspected of accidental or intentional death. Harold was a troubled individual, there was no doubt about it. His mother passed away at a young age, and he struggled with drug abuse in his early career as a doctor and was even admitted to a facility. However, it wasn't put on his record and he was only given a warning. This allowed him to continue practicing and even to get his own private practice, which may sound like a fortunate second chance, although that optimism slips away when you realize what happened within his private practice. Harold was no longer addicted to heroin, but he was seemingly addicted to giving his target patients a lethal dose of diamorphine, the same drug that was given to his mother when she was dying. Harold Shipman was suspected of killing his victims as early as 1975, and it wasn't until 1998 when suspicions of foul play began to become overwhelming. As in small communities, word spreads quickly, and it was at that point when Harold Shipman was investigated. Upon investigation, it was confirmed that Harold Shipman's mortality rate as a doctor was 10 times above the average. Yet, when the health authority investigated all of the paperwork associated with these patients and their deaths, they found no irregularities, which which at the time lowered suspicion. But as we know now, these papers were actually forged to fit the stories that he was spinning. And while the health authority was investigating the patients, the Greater Manchester Police were investigating Shipman, and unfortunately also failed, as they weren't even able to find his criminal history or the time he spent in an institution for his drug abuse. What this essentially means is that this first investigation into Harold Shipman almost cleared his name. It didn't clear suspicions, but legally speaking, Harold was doing nothing wrong. He was a standard doctor who unfortunately had some unlucky clients. But this story didn't last for long. Only a few months later, on June 24th, 1998, Harold made a very distinct choice that led directly to him being caught. Harold Shipman was at the home of one of his patients, a woman named Kathleen Grundy. This woman was 81 years old and described as being in great health. She had an appointment with Shipman at her home to have a routine blood test, although what she got instead was a lethal dose of diamorphine. As per his standard practice, he quickly wrote her death certificate and stated her cause of death as old age and suggested she be cremated immediately. But that wasn't the only document he forged. Somewhat unusually, he also forged a will, and it was Kathleen's will, giving all of her worldly possessions to her doctor, Harold Shipman. And it was this move specifically that raised more than a few red flags. Kathleen was a former mayor of Hyde, and for that reason was a notable person in the community, and her death was very upsetting to many, particularly her family, who were shocked not only that their healthy mother and grandmother passed away, but also that she'd left all of her money to her doctor. And with that, they began investigating Harold themselves, when they quickly realized that he was behind not only the forgery, but also the death. The family was able to confirm that Harold's fingerprints were on the will that he forged, and that the will was even typed on his typewriter that was missing a key, which undoubtedly confirmed that he was the one who wrote it. And this family somehow was able to find out about Harold's past when the police weren't able to, which at the very least is odd and borderline negligent by the police. Kathleen's family demanded that her body be autopsied, and it was during that autopsy when it was found that she had a lethal dose of diamorphine in her muscle tissue, and Harold Shipman was arrested for the murder of Kathleen Grundy. Once he was arrested, the family of 11 other victims who had their family member buried and not cremated opted to have their family members' bodies examined by the police. And these examinations also showed that these 11 other patients of Harold Shipman were also victims of his. And it was at this time that Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 murders from 1995 to 1998. Although in the investigations that followed his initial conviction, there was over 284 confirmed killings by Harold Shipman. And there are even more that are unconfirmed but likely possible. Just let that sink in. He was only convicted of 15 murders, but he was confirmed to have killed at least 284 of his patients, likely from the years of 1975 to 1998. Harold received life in prison, although only a few years into his sentence, he ended his own life on January 13th, 2004 at the age of 57. Shipman never gave any motive for his murders and never admitted to any of it. These are just 3 cases of how some of the most infamous serial killers were caught. And if you are interested in hearing more, unfortunately, there is more stories to tell. How the most infamous serial killers were caught. The date is April 16th, 1975. You are Sergeant Bob Hayward, a Utah Highway Patrol officer doing his nightly patrol. You're driving up and down suburban roads thinking about this crazy shark movie that just came out called Jaws, when all of a sudden you notice something peculiar. You see a tan 1968 Volkswagen Beetle parked outside of a house at 3 a.m. Reasonably, this looks suspicious to you, so you take a closer look. However, as you approach the vehicle, they speed off. You pursue this vehicle, and fortunately, you're able to pull it over. This person was obviously up to no good, and you don't know what you're walking up to. You exit your cruiser and walk towards the vehicle with your gun drawn. Deep down, you're terrified, and you just hope that the other person is more terrified than you are. You command the driver to get out of the Beetle, and they comply. They apologize and say that they were just up late watching a movie in the drive-in theater. However, the movie the suspect claimed they had seen at the drive-in wasn't playing at the drive-in, and you knew that, which made you suspicious enough to check their vehicle. A decision that likely has a significant impact on the course of history. During the search of your vehicle, you find a lot of things, and it seems that they only get more and more grim. You find gloves, pantyhose, ripped sheets, rope, a flashlight, a ski mask, an ice pick, trash bags, and handcuffs. Things that normal people don't keep in their vehicle. Although possessing these items and keeping them in your car is suspicious, it's not a crime. However, fortunately, you were able to still bring this suspect in for evading an officer. You collect information about your suspect and you realize that his name is Ted Bundy, a name that you will soon never forget. Ted wasn't in jail long as he was freed on bond, but your findings in his vehicle were enough to get you talking, specifically to your fellow officers. You speak to detectives at your station about this encounter, and they too find the description of this Volkswagen Beetle and the name Bundy oddly familiar. It's at this point when the detectives in Utah contact investigators in Washington, where they learn that this weird Bundy guy was on their very short list of murder suspects in a series of murders. Coincidentally, however, the murders that took place in Washington stopped as soon as Bundy left and relocated from Washington to Utah. And coincidentally as well, disappearances then started to begin in Utah. If alarm bells weren't already ringing, they were now off the chain. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming it's no spoiler that Ted Bundy is one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. His unbelievably depraved actions are the reason we still talk about him to this day, as a cautionary tale. Let me quickly summarize his methods. Ted Bundy was a wolf in sheep's clothing, always hidden in plain sight. Although he was an active serial killer, he was working within the justice system and was even present on his own crime scenes. Not only that, but he had an unassuming character. He was considered handsome, looked and acted normal, and was considered charming by some. And he more so fit the description of a model citizen than a serial killer, which is one of the biggest reasons why he was able to go on for so long without being caught. It's actually quite upsetting to know how many pretty obvious clues were ignored by the police simply because they just didn't assume Ted was the type of guy to do that, which is obviously why you should never judge a book by its cover. Ted Bundy was a very methodical killer, with a system that he had down to a science. Ted preyed on primarily young white women. He would typically lurk around colleges and universities where he could easily find his next victim. But he usually wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was directly in your face and would approach women, typically in an arm sling or crutches to appear helpless and to gain sympathy points from the woman, and he would ask random women if they would be able to help him either put books in his car or something along those lines. Basically any lie to get the women to believe that they're helping a helpless, kind gentleman do something in or around his car. And if these kind women did make it to his vehicle, chances were it was basically done for them. At this point, Ted would bludgeon these women, typically to the point of unconsciousness or even death, and then do a multitude of things, typically engaging in on top of mutilating the body in ways that I can't even begin to explain, such as cutting off the victim's head and keeping it as a trophy and taking pictures with his victims as a sort of twisted, happy memory. And then once he felt he was done, he would dump the body somewhere, typically in multiple pieces. But even then, in some instances, he wasn't done, as there is cases where he would go back to visit these bodies he had dumped multiple times. Ted Bundy was extremely twisted, but fortunately, this video is focused on justice. And in this case, justice was served, albeit much later than it should have been. The string of murders committed by Ted Bundy had been going on for years at this point. But on November 8th, 1974, 1 year before his run-in with the police at the beginning of this segment, Bundy kidnapped a woman that would soon become his downfall. He picked up this 18-year-old woman from the Fashion Place Mall outside of Salt Lake City, Utah. And of course, he had devious intentions. But unlike many before her, she was able to escape, saving her life. Over 1 year later, on October 2nd in 1975, only 2 months after the run-in with the police, this same woman picked Bundy out of a lineup in the police station, confirming that this man was the man who kidnapped her 1 year prior. And this one positive ID in this one police lineup was able to bring this entire thing to justice, as 1 year later, on March 1st, 1976, Bundy was found guilty for kidnapping and sentenced up to 15 years. Obviously, Bundy did much worse than kidnapping, but this was a start. And for him, he saw this as the beginning of the end. But if you think this is the conclusion of how Ted Bundy got caught, you're definitely mistaken, because this is only the first of many times this man was caught. In 1977, another year later, Bundy was extradited to Colorado for the murder of one of his victims, which was progress in terms of justice. But during this time, he escaped from a second-story window when he was left alone for only a few moments. He spent 6 days living in the wild outside of the prison in Aspen and was then found and taken back into custody. However, only a few months later, he escaped from his jail cell in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. And things took a dark turn once again. Bundy wasn't living in the woods for 6 days. He was on the run for months, and during this time, he would attack 5 people and kill 3 of them. And by people, I mean young, innocent women. On February 15th, 1978, another officer spotted a stolen vehicle around 1:30 a.m. in Pensacola, Florida, and decided to pursue this vehicle. Once again, Bundy was taken into custody, and this officer didn't even know the level of monster that he had in the back of his cruiser. When Bundy was brought to the police station, he refused to say his name for over 2 days. A detective was able to get him to confess that his name was Theodore Chapman Bundy, but for some reason the detective didn't connect the dots and realize that this was Ted Bundy, the serial killer that was currently on the loose. Fortunately, this mistake wasn't extremely consequential, as they did shortly after connect the dots. And on July 24th, 1979, Ted Bundy was convicted on 2 counts of murder. Although while he was in custody, he admitted to over 30 murders, and there is suspected to be even more, although those are not confirmed. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed at Florida State Prison at the age of 42. So now, if somebody asks you, how did Ted Bundy get caught? Not only do you know the answer, but now you know to ask, well, which time? The time he was first brought into custody for acting suspicious, the time that he ran away from the courthouse and was in the trees for 6 days and then was caught and brought back, the time that he broke out of prison with a hacksaw and was on another killing rampage for 2 months before being brought back. There's a few times he was caught, but in all seriousness, my description of this case only scratches the surface, and even the process of how he was caught and his court chronicles, where he not only represented himself but also proposed to his girlfriend at the time in court. There's a lot of lore to this story, and if you want to learn more about it, I actually have a video that goes specifically in depth on these serial killers, which I'll put at the end of the video. Bundy was executed via the electric chair with crowds watching as he perished, and his final words were a message of love for his family and friends, if he even had any left. The year is 1978. You're a police officer in Ohio. It's Friday night and you just started your shift. Due to a new safe driving initiative, you're tasked with field sobriety tests. And so far, your night is uneventful. A car drives up to your cruiser and stops. You look inside the vehicle and it's a young man. An awkward looking one at that. He and the car both seem normal, but you get an odd vibe. You ask him if he'd been drinking and awkwardly, he says no. He doesn't seem drunk, just strange. And to alleviate your discomfort, you let him go. Little did you know, the person that you just spoke with wasn't any ordinary teenager. You just stopped one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. Not only that, he had the body of his first victim in the car with him. You had just let go Jeffrey Dahmer. If this police officer had potentially acted more so on his strange feeling and looked around more, potentially one of the most infamous and disgusting serial killers would have been caught a lot sooner. But unfortunately, this early encounter was uneventful and marked the beginning of his disgusting killing spree. Jeffrey Dahmer, similar to Ted Bundy, was a rather unassuming serial killer who was social, active in the community, likable, and for those reasons, able to operate almost directly under the nose of the police for way longer than he ever should have been able to. Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't a particularly brilliant serial killer who crossed all of his T's and dotted all of his I's. If you're familiar with how he committed his murders and what he did after the fact, there was a lot of opportunities for evidence to be found and dots to be connected, and unfortunately, the police took way too long to connect those dots. Jeffrey Dahmer's father was an analytical chemist, which may seem unassuming but led to a morbid curiosity that ended up consuming Jeffrey Dahmer's life. Jeffrey's father taught him how to preserve animal bones with bleach, and they would even look around their property together to find dead animals to dissect and preserve and bleach the skin and connective tissue of these dead animals. Jeffrey's father thought he was sharing insight into his career with potentially interesting information, but to Jeffrey, this information was highly interesting and unfortunately it was taken in a completely wrong direction, which we'll get into. On top of this weird dissection and scientific process, if you want to call it that, Jeff showed signs of trauma in his younger years, specifically torturing animals and being rather quiet and reserved. His father even admitted that there were signs that he didn't notice at the time, which is questionable. After graduating high school, Dahmer attended a party, something he did relatively often as he tried his best to be social and was at this point already experiencing a rather nasty alcohol addiction. On the way home after this party, Jeffrey picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, another 18-year-old man. They both went back to Dahmer's place to hang out and drink, and while Stephen didn't have any sort of romantic intentions, Jeffrey did. And when Jeffrey got the clue that things likely weren't going to happen, he took matters into his own hands in the worst way possible. Dahmer grabbed a dumbbell and hit this man over the head, knocking him unconscious. He then strangled the man and then assaulted his body for his own personal satisfaction. And then at that point, used what he had been practicing on animals on a person for the first time. And unfortunately, this was not the only time either. After mutilating and dismembering the body, Dahmer packed it into his car where he was driving to dispose of it. And it was on this drive where Dahmer met the police officer. If only this police officer chose to do a search, we would be living in a much different timeline. But unfortunately, that was not the case. And although Dahmer was caught, he was not caught then. And after this instance, he was able to kill and hurt many more people. At the age of 19, Dahmer got involved in the military, where he was suspected to have done unsolved unsavory things with soldiers and was kicked out at the age of 22. After this, he began his hand in the professional world where he was unsuccessful in holding a steady job due to his alcohol abuse. He started exposing himself to women and children at playgrounds where he was caught and charged for indecent exposure, although this will be one of his most tame convictions we touch on in this entire video. Dahmer's sadistic urges were beginning to take a hold of him, and he was back on the hunt, looking for control. It was around this time in his early 20s where Dahmer began frequenting bathhouses and gay bars, where he would meet men, hang out, and then take control, to put it in his words. Dahmer was most commonly drinking these men that he was meeting under the table, and due to his high alcohol tolerance, the people that he was with were unable to keep up and likely would pass out before Jeffrey was even feeling a buzz. In these instances, Jeffrey would take advantage of these people, but even with how manipulative and horrible this is still only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Jeffrey Dahmer. He wasn't really convicted for any of these unwanted touchings, but he did get a 1-year probationary sentence for indecent exposure once again. In 1987, Dahmer knew that indecent exposure and drugging and assaulting men just wasn't enough, and he felt that he needed to get back to his old ways. Dahmer said that this second murder in the beginning of this next chapter of serial killings was actually an accident. He said he just woke up in a hotel with a dead person beside him. And even if that was true, any normal person would at that point call the police. But of course, that's not what Jeff did. Dahmer stuffed this person into a suitcase and took him out of the hotel. He took this body back to his grandmother's house, where he dismembered it, assaulted the body, and cut this person's head off and boiled it to keep the skull for his own personal use, to say the least. This trend would continue drugging, assaulting, and killing men over the next years. I know I've already gotten into detail, but there is so many disgusting and gruesome details associated with exactly what Jeffrey Dahmer would do to his victims, and there is a ton of videos about that. So let's focus in on the point of this video. Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. But how exactly did he get caught? Well, as he continued his spree, he got less and less cautious and more hasty, as he simply cared less and less and was too caught up in his own fantasies, it seemed. On July 22nd, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer lured a man named Tracy Edwards into his apartment, offering to pay him $100 for nude photographs. When they got to the apartment, that's when things started to go wrong. Dahmer attempted to handcuff this man and threatened him with a knife, and Edward smartly played along, trying to keep Dahmer calm and unassuming of him trying to escape. After spending 5 hours together, Tracy was able to punch Dahmer in the face and flee, getting out of the apartment and onto the street where he flagged down 2 police officers. At this point, Tracy was barely clothed and still had a handcuff on his wrist. The police followed Tracy back to Dahmer's apartment where Dahmer admitted to putting handcuffs on this man, but doing nothing wrong. However, the police weren't satisfied with that answer and searched the apartment, which is when one of the officers discovered Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies. And after seeing this evidence, the police handcuffed Dahmer after a bit of a power struggle. A search that took place later on uncovered a collection of human remains and other vile things that I won't even get into. Dahmer confessed to all of the murders and waived his right to a lawyer during his interrogations. And over a 2-week span, detectives were able to get Dahmer to admit to his crimes and detail them specifically. And in detail, he outlined 17 murders of men and boys between 1978 and 1991. The following year, on January 13th, 1992, Dahmer pled guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder. Dahmer wasn't sentenced to death in the court system, but he was by another inmate. And during his time serving 15 consecutive life sentences, he was beaten to death with a blunt object by another inmate. Some people thought this was a poetic ending to his reign of terrors, while others didn't think that this was quite justice. No matter how you feel about this situation, the Jeffrey Dahmer story is extremely upsetting and honestly disgusting, and if you haven't seen it yet, there's an entire Netflix documentary about it. But to answer your question, how was Jeffrey Dahmer caught? One of his victims was finally able to escape and expose his human deli to the police and eventually the world. I do want to say that because I do post weekly, I'm not able to make extremely long videos. I try my best though, and I think on average 15 to 30 minutes isn't bad. But with that being said, unfortunately, there is a lot of serial killers that have existed, and fortunately, there are a lot who have also been caught. Ideally, there wouldn't be any serial killers to catch, but that's a different story. I say this because if you guys enjoyed this topic and this video, I would love to make another one, potentially a part 2, and maybe even make a series out of it. So before we get into our last killer, if you guys enjoy learning about these serial killers and how they eventually got caught, let me know in the comments below or give this video a like. If I see enough comments, then I will definitely make a part 2. Now, let's start the story. You're a young man in the Chicago area, and you're looking for a job. You just graduated high school and you don't want to go to college, you want to get into the trades. It's a growing opportunity that doesn't require an education, and that interests you. Your uncle's friend is a local business owner and politician, and he says that this man could help get you a job. He introduces you to this man and you guys set plans to discuss a potential employment opportunity. This man invites you over to dinner, which you're rather comfortable with because you've seen this man before and you've even been to a few of his events. He's been known to have block parties and he even likes to dress up at times as a clown, of all things. During your time with this man, you guys discussed employment opportunities, pay, expectations, previous experience, and all of the regular things you may expect you would discuss during a job interview. The interview comes to a close and you feel optimistic, hoping that you're gonna get a job soon and potentially start a lifelong career, when the man you've been sitting across the table with asks you if you want to see a cool trick. You don't want to be rude, so you go with it, and he invites you into his basement. In the basement, he shows you handcuffs, and you're interested and kind of confused. Where did you get these? Are these real? How do they work? He doesn't really explain, but he says, put them on, I'm gonna show you something. So once again, almost hesitantly, you go with it. You allow him to handcuff you, and then he shows you that he has the keys, but not in a reassuring way, almost in a taunting sort of way. At this point, the vibe shifts immediately, and the professional man that you were just talking to upstairs is now a creepy and demented seeming individual who, at the drop of a hat, switched. The man who you thought would become your boss is now picking up a hammer, and he is now becoming the last thing you would ever see. That man was John Wayne Gacy. We're really 3 for 3 in this video because John Wayne Gacy, like Jeffrey Dahmer and like Ted Bundy, was a very unassuming person who also committed most of his crimes in the 70s, which is an interesting overlap as well. I wonder if there was something in the water, but who knows? John Wayne Gacy lived in the northern suburbs of Chicago and owned a successful construction company and was a seemingly loyal father and husband to his second wife and 2 stepdaughters. He even attended church and was active in the Polish community. Gacy was also involved in the Democratic Party and through that had some interesting connections. Connections that I'm assuming now wish they had nothing to do with Gacy. Gacy was known, like I mentioned in the story, for throwing block parties, inviting the police, neighbors, and anybody in the community who wanted to celebrate, enjoy food, and even see a clown perform some tricks. That clown being Pogo the Clown, which was Gacy's alter ego. But even in this condition, in the northern suburbs of Chicago, living a seemingly nice life, before anything was ever found out, before he was ever caught for his 32 murders, he already had a dark and shadowy past. Gacy was previously arrested for assaulting 2 young men in Iowa. And if that's not crazy enough, this was also the exact same time when his first wife was giving birth to his child. Literally insane. For these crimes in Iowa, Gacy was caught and served time in prison. He was sentenced to 10 years but only got 18 months and was released on parole. So technically that was the first time Gacy was caught, but that's not the only time he was caught, so let's keep going. It was after this release from prison when Gacy divorced his first wife and moved to Chicago, where now we're up to speed. From the outside, it seemed that Gacy was living a great and rather successful life, but that couldn't be further from the truth. His marriage was falling apart after telling his wife that he was bisexual and wanting to get men involved in their relations, and their divorce left Gacy a lot of free time to indulge in his fantasies. On December 7th, 1976, a young man named Robert, who was working at a pharmacy, stayed after work to talk to a man who said that he could have a construction job available for him. Sound familiar? Gacy offered to pay him double what he was making. An interesting proposal to anybody. This young pharmacist obviously was never seen again. And worst of all, while Robert was meeting with Gacy, his mom was outside waiting for him to finish work and to drive him home, as she was his ride and she was gonna take him home so they could spend time together, as it was his mom's birthday. Once again, horrible timing. Fortunately, in this situation, the police weren't completely oblivious. And almost immediately after this case was brought to the police were already suspecting something was up with Gacy, specifically because they knew about his past. And one of the detectives on this case even called Gacy directly. Although, to be fair, one of Gacy's own employees went missing, and when people begged the police to investigate Gacy then, which was only a year prior, those requests were ignored. If you really want to be mad, in 1977, a young man went to the police station and reported that Gacy had kidnapped him and threatened him with a gun. And when questioned, Gacy admitted to the entire situation, but said that it was consensual and that this man was lying. And the police sided with Gacy in this situation, and he was let off. I know, crazy. I didn't mean for this video to be a compilation of horrible police work, but that's definitely becoming a common theme. Back to the Rob situation. After the investigation continued, the police were able to get a search warrant for Gacy after he was late for the interview that they requested of him. Gacy reluctantly gave his keys to the police and he was held at the station while they searched his home. The police found a receipt for a roll of film that Rob had owned, proving that Rob had been in Gacy's house. And they also found a ring that another lost boy was missing. Although they weren't able to charge him with anything with these facts, they were able to put him under surveillance, but they did have to let him go at this point in time. Strangely, while under surveillance, Gacy invited the 2 police officers watching him into his house and offered them coffee. These officers noticed a horrible smell inside the house, a smell that a police officer would definitely recognize. The smell of death. But still, this wasn't the end quite yet. Days later, while still obviously under surveillance, Gacy was caught selling weed to a gas station employee where he was arrested and once again interrogated, where detectives had more ammo to interrogate him with, and they threatened to literally rip up his floorboards if he did not tell the truth, which they obviously meant hypothetically, but physically they did end up doing that and finding exactly what they were looking for. While in jail, he did admit to killing 1 person, but claimed it was only self-defense. Gacy led police to the place in his basement where he hid 1 body, and upon further investigation, the police found a trapdoor where they found at least 3 other bodies. When this information was shared with Gacy and Gacy knew the jig was up, he went on a multi-hour-long rant, speaking in the 3rd person like a lunatic, admitting to everything, and claimed that he had killed at least 32 young men and boys, and that 27 of them were buried on his property. In April of 1979, a grand jury indicted Gacy on a total of 33 murders, which at that point in history was the largest number of murders associated with 1 person. While in custody, Gacy admitted to more and more gruesome details about his murders, and the police were able to validate all of these stories by finding evidence within his home. On February 6, 1980, Gacy pled not guilty to all of the charges, and his lawyers tried to pull a insanity card, but that didn't work. Gacy was of course found guilty and sentenced to death. After 15 years on death row, Gacy was killed by lethal injection on May 10th, 1994. But there you have it. 3 of the most infamous serial killers and how they got caught. The similarities between these people are rather glaring, and I think it's important to note that when we talk about such depraved individuals, that these are real people that hurt real people, that have real families, and there are real victims in this situation. Crazy missing persons cases that are still unsolved. Kenneth Lee Veach was born in Clark County, Las Vegas in 1967. He was always drawn to the nature that surrounded him, and throughout his adolescence into his adulthood loved anything that involved being outside and experiencing nature. Kenneth, or Kenny, was actually so passionate about his outdoor excursions that he had an entire YouTube channel dedicated to documenting his adventures, as well as his inventions, with the channel being named Snakebit McGee. The channel still exists to this day and has 73,000 subscribers, and it currently has 5 videos posted on it, with the most ominous being named M Cave Hike. The reason why this video is significant is what we'll be getting into, and is directly correlated with the mysterious disappearance of Kenny Veach. The year is 2014, and Kenny Veach is on YouTube looking at interesting videos, similar to what you're doing right now. And Kenny happened to stumble on a video that was rather obscure. It was a video of a son of an Area 51 technician, and in this video he was talking about things that his father had told him while drunk. After watching this video, Kenny left a comment describing a very odd situation he experienced near Area 51 himself. In the comment, he mentioned that when he was hiking in the Sheep Range, which is very close to Area 51, he discovered a cave that was shaped like the letter M. As he approached this cave, the cave made his body vibrate, and the closer that he got to this cave, the more that his body began to vibrate and feel unease. He described the feeling as uncomfortable and made him feel scared, so scared in fact that he didn't approach the cave any further, and actually did the exact opposite, fleeing from the cave immediately and going directly back to his car, cutting his hike short. This comment was simply intended to share a peculiar story that happened also with Area 51, but his comment quickly gained attention. People began to reply to Kenny's comment, either questioning the authenticity behind it, sharing sympathy, or even motivating him to go and revisit this location to find the truth and dig deeper on what exactly was going on. After getting enough responses of people either telling him his story was fake or telling him that he needs to prove his claim or seek more truth by revisiting the cave, he planned a second trip. And in October of 2014, Kenny Veach returned to the Sheep Range outside of Area 51 in an attempt to locate the M-shaped cave. This second trip was documented, and that documentation is the video titled M Cave Hike. Already, there's some interesting things about this situation. Specifically, that in this 20-minute video, Veach reported that he saw a black Ram truck watching him from the ridgeline in the mountain range behind him this entire hike that he was having. And he was also not able to find this cave the second time around. But obviously, the mystery doesn't end here, and it's only truly beginning. After the first hike ending in fear and abandonment, and the second hike ending in failure, Kenny planned a third trip, where he publicly announced that he would be looking for the M Cave and be finding it once and for all. On November 10th, 2014, only a few weeks after the second attempt, Kenny Veach went on a third expedition looking for the M Cave. This third hike was like any other hike Kenny could have gone on. He packed a cell phone, a gun, and other supplies into his truck, and even informed his girlfriend before he left what he was up to and where he was going to be. He did not give specific details about his location, but he did tell her that he was going on a trip, he was looking for the M Cave, and he would be back at some point, which was typical behavior for Kenny. He was an experienced outdoorsman, and it wasn't uncommon for him to spend multiple days outside alone. Although when Kenny left for this third expedition looking for the M Cave, he was never seen again. After several days of not hearing anything from Kenny, his girlfriend reported him missing, and a large-scale search was underway. The search party looking for Kenny consisted of volunteers and officials from the Nevada Search and Rescue Team, and these men and women worked tirelessly day and night, searching high and low through mountains and caves of the Mojave Desert. One of the biggest challenges these search and rescue teams faced was the fact that the general location that Kenny said he was going was not an easy hike at all. It was mountainous. The landscape was dotted with old mine shafts. The area itself was isolated, and according to Kenny in old forum posts, it took roughly 10 hours of hiking to go from his car to the M Cave, meaning that this search and rescue crew had a lot of ground to cover. On top of just geographical issues, this area was also known for being dangerous. Specifically because it was so remote and so isolated, there was reports of drug activity and even bodies being dumped in the general area. Not to mention being literally beside a military base, there was also claims of reported chemical disposal in the area as well. However, even with this uphill battle that the volunteers and search and rescue team were facing, they still continued their search. And on November 22nd, 12 days after Kenny had initially left for this third trip to the M Cave, the search team found something. Near an abandoned mine shaft, one of the search and rescue members found a cell phone that was confirmed to have been owned by Kenny Veach. But unfortunately, this was the only piece of evidence that was ever found. There was no piece of clothing, no other personal items, and no clues anywhere. The only information that the phone really gave was that Kenny likely got to where he was looking to go, as this phone was in the general location that Kenny described the M Cave being in. But that's where the facts end and the speculation begins. Because after the disappearance of Kenny Veach gained attention, people began to have a plethora of theories. Likely the most possible and accepted conclusion to the story actually comes from Kenny's girlfriend herself. As years after this entire situation happened, she was informed that Kenny's story was going viral online, and she felt compelled to leave a comment on Kenny's M Cave hike video. The comment is long, and if you want to read it in its entirety, on screen is a screenshot, and I will quickly mention the main points Kenny's girlfriend Sharon makes. One of the biggest revelations that Sharon shares in this comment was that Kenny had been struggling with depression for many years. She, being his girlfriend, was obviously aware of this, and he had opened up to her, and he had made it clear to her that in the time leading up to his disappearance, it was progressively getting worse. And Kenny had even expressed his thoughts of suicide to Sharon directly. That alone is extremely upsetting, both for Kenny and for his girlfriend, who had to carry that burden with him. And if you or a loved one have experienced depression, then you know how upsetting even that part of the story is. One chilling quote Kenny mentioned to Sharon was that if he ever decided to end things, quote, "No one will ever find me." On top of sharing this quote, she also stated a very interesting fact, that Kenny had not taken his video camera for this third attempt to find the M Cave, which was odd because his second attempt was filmed, and he even hyped up his third attempt in video. So why would he not bring his camera on a trip that he publicly said he would be filming? Sharon claims that he didn't take his camera because he obviously didn't intend to record anything. On top of sharing facts, Sharon also shared a few of her own suspicions. She believes that Kenny specifically left his phone in a mine shaft to avoid being tracked. And she even states explicitly that, quote, "I believe he committed suicide. He battled depression for many years and would not take medication or see a doctor. He quit his job a little more than a year before he disappeared." Truthfully, I don't know if anybody could possibly make a stronger claim than Sharon. She was in a committed, long-term relationship with Kenny, knew the ins and outs of his personality and life, and was the last person who ever saw Kenny. However, with Kenny never being found, it's impossible to confirm these claims. And when facts aren't concrete, people are always going to make their own assumptions. Leading to the other two theories, surrounding Kenny's disappearance. The second theory is that Kenny simply experienced an accidental death, which is possible considering the conditions that Kenny was hiking in. The Nevada desert is harsh, with extremely hot and extremely cold temperatures. And specifically in the area of the M Cave, there was a plethora of old mine shafts to potentially fall into. However, the elephant in the room obviously is the fact that Kenny was experienced in this area. And on top of being experienced in this specific area, he was also an experienced outdoorsman, making this theory a bit tough to believe, but still plausible. However, the third theory is really just a conspiracy theory, and is essentially just the belief that Kenny was getting too close to finding something out. And for that reason, Kenny was killed by the US military, specifically so he didn't discover the secret of the M Cave. It's definitely out there, but with no facts and no sign of Kenny ever being found, it's not impossible. Potentially one of the most interesting facts about this entire situation is that even though so many aspects of the story are still available online, Kenny's YouTube channel, Kenny's video about the M Cave, Kenny's girlfriend's comment on the M Cave video, the one thing that was removed from the internet was Kenny's comment on the original video that sparked this entire situation. Whether Kenny deleted it or someone else deleted it, the comment was there and somewhere along the line was removed. Nobody truly knows what happened to Kenny Veach and where he may be today, dead or alive. It's Saturday, October the 21st, 1978. Relatively new pilot Frederick Valentich was embarking on a short training flight in a Cessna 128L light aircraft. The flight itself wasn't extremely long, only 232 kilometers or 125 nautical miles. And this flight was connecting Melbourne, Australia to King Island following the Bass Strait. At this point, Frederick had 150 total flight hours and even held a Class 4 instrument rating, which authorized him to fly at night with the restriction of only being able to fly at night in visible meteorological conditions, essentially meaning clear enough skies to be able to see the ground, terrain, and other aircraft. Frederick had also applied twice to enlist in the Royal Australian Air Force, but was rejected each time due to inadequate educational qualifications. Although as determined as Frederick was to become a pilot, his grades weren't necessarily reflecting his passion. On top of actively taking training flights and also being in the Air Training Corps for the Australian Air Force, Frederick was also studying to become a commercial pilot as well. Although even with all of his training, he failed all 5 of his commercial license exams twice. Even with failed exams and rejected applications, Frederick was motivated to fly, and this brings us back to October 21st, 1978. Frederick's takeoff was normal, and the beginning of his flight appeared to be relatively calm and uneventful, although things began to get peculiar when he radioed to the Melbourne flight service at 7:06 p.m. It was in this radio message that he reported an unidentified aircraft that was following him at 4,500 feet. Air traffic control confirmed that there was no traffic at that level, although Frederick was certain that he was seeing something. Frederick replied stating that he could see a large unknown aircraft, which appeared to be illuminated but couldn't confirm the exact type of plane he was looking at. And then quickly after confirmed that this plane had passed over him, roughly 1,000 feet above him, moving at a very fast speed. Once again, air traffic control had no answers. Almost immediately after, Frederick radioed in again, saying that this aircraft was orbiting above him and that it had a shiny metal surface with a green light on it. And then also stated that this other pilot might be purposely toying with him in his aircraft. And it was with his next radio message that Frederick revealed something concerning. He was experiencing engine problems. But before Frederick could even finish his sentence, air traffic control was asking him, what kind of plane is this? To which Frederick could only say, it's not an aircraft. And it was right after he said these words. His transmissions were interrupted by the sounds of metallic scraping, all contact was lost, and Frederick was never heard from again. It wasn't long after the connection was cut that a search and rescue mission was underway, and a sea and air search took place to find him as soon as possible. The search went on for 4 days, and was concluded on October 25th, 1978 with no results. No sign of Frederick, no signs of his plane. The investigation was simply presumed fatal. The story is obviously upsetting and doesn't end there, and I didn't even mention this earlier, but when this all took place, Frederick was only 20 years old. He was a young, semi-experienced, and also struggling pilot. Frederick also had gotten into legal trouble from some of his flights, specifically for accidentally flying into controlled air zones in Sydney and even intentionally flying into clouds, which was prohibited for his classifications. Both of these are odd because if you are dedicating your life to a career in aviation, why would you intentionally fly into clouds on multiple occasions if you knew it could lead to prosecution, which in his case, it almost did. Those facts are interesting, but what's also interesting is a quote from Frederick's father, who stated that Frederick was not only a large believer in UFOs, UFOs, but was also seriously worried about being attacked by them on his flights. It's even stated that 6 days before his disappearance, Frederick talked to his girlfriend specifically about the possibility that a UFO could take him away. And potentially what's most odd about this entire flight that Frederick took was the fact that he never told anybody the truth of why he was taking this flight. Sure, it was a relatively standard training flight, but why on a Saturday evening? His flight took off at 6 p.m. and it was a multi-hour flight. It's reported that Frederick told flight officials that he was just going to King Island to pick up some friends and fly them back. But it's also reported that he told other officials that he was going to pick up crayfish. And after the disappearance happened, investigations confirmed that both of these stated reasons were untrue. But that's where the facts end. And once again, where the speculation begins to run wild. All we know is that we have a 20-year-old struggling pilot in training who has an interesting obsession and fear of UFOs, who took a mysterious flight from Melbourne to King Island, and during this flight claimed to have seen a UFO and was never seen again. But it's curious to think of what could have possibly happened. And obviously, since 46 years have passed since this entire situation happened, some theories have popped up. One of the official suspicions comes from the Western Australia Department of Transportation, who stated that Frederick became disoriented, saw his own lights reflected in the water, or saw a nearby island while flying upside down, which is potentially plausible, but there was no communication indicating that Frederick was in such a situation that would have left him upside down. Some people believe that Frederick actually staged his own disappearance, and instead of going to King Island, was actually going to Cape Otway, which was possible to fly to with the plane that Frederick was in and with the amount of fuel that he had. And although there's no radar to confirm this activity in the Cape Otway area, Melbourne police did receive reports of a mysterious landing that took place by a light aircraft at the same time that Frederick disappeared. A third and potentially most disheartening theory is that Frederick did this intentionally. Although interviews with doctors and personal friends of Frederick all stated that this was likely impossible, which, I mean, nothing's impossible, but if nobody thinks that this is the case, I think there's validity that this might not be the answer. And one of the last major groups of belief involves aliens. Basically, UFOologists claim that UFOs either destroyed Frederick's ship with Frederick inside or abducted him and then destroyed his ship. And you could potentially put some validity on these claims due to what Frederick was actually saying in his radio comms. Those are kind of three of the initial theories, but there are actually more modern theories that are definitely worth mentioning. The first comes from Brian Dunning, who made the observation that the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out a few years before this entire situation, and the things that Frederick was saying on the radio kind of sounded similar from some of the dialogue from the movie, not to mention the fact that this movie was also popular with pilots. So with that information, Dunning ultimately speculated that Frederick likely was trying to reenact the scene in real life for his own, personal enjoyment. He was deliberately flying his aircraft in a sporadic manner to kind of put on a show for air traffic controllers, but within him having this fun and saying these lies and flying in an unsafe way, he essentially became disoriented and crashed unintentionally. I'm not sure how valid it is, but I think it's interesting to consider, specifically knowing that he did intentionally fly into clouds when he wasn't supposed to, so it's not like he wasn't against breaking the rules. So if you really loved this movie and really loved aliens, maybe he thought it'd be cool to take a little flight, tell the story on the way, and then once he came back, he'd be like, wow, that was crazy, I had a UFO encounter, and just basically allow that legend to live on as part of his personal lore. But like I mentioned, these are all speculations, and the mystery of the missing pilot, Frederick Valentich, remains to this day unsolved, 46 years and 6 months later. Unfortunately, there is a lot more unsolved missing persons cases. And if you guys truly enjoyed this video and would like me to create a series out of it, just leave a comment below or leave a like. Your support never goes unnoticed and is always appreciated. But with that being said, let's continue to the final story. The year is 1993, and we are days away from the much-anticipated Super Bowl weekend. David Glenn Lewis, like almost any man at the time, was excited about Super Bowl weekend. And coincidentally, David was about to have Super Bowl weekend all to himself. David was a lawyer and a family man, and he lived with his wife and daughter in Amarillo, Texas. David's wife and daughter were actually going to Houston for the weekend to have a bit of a getaway, and specifically do some shopping. Now, this is a trip that David would typically be a part of, but because this was Super Bowl weekend, he decided that he'd stay back because he didn't want to miss the big game, and likely just wanted some alone time as well. On Friday, January 29th, 1993, David's wife and daughter left for their planned shopping trip in Dallas. But on January 31st, after what I can only imagine to be a fun shopping trip, David's wife and daughter returned home slightly later in the evening, basically right after after the Super Bowl ended. But what they came home to was a bit peculiar. The TV was on, the VCR was actually still recording the game, there was 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches in the fridge, there was laundry in the laundry machine, David's wedding ring and watch were on the kitchen counter, but David was nowhere to be seen. David's wife, Karen, obviously assumed David was somewhere nearby, potentially watching the game at a friend's house, although when they didn't find him at all that night, they began to get concerned. The following morning, on February 1st, David's wife, Karen, called the police and reported him missing. But like every other story in this video, this isn't where the story ends. It's where the story begins. And in this story specifically, the twist at the end of it is potentially the most mind-boggling in this entire video. Back to February 1st. What happened? Karen was convinced that her husband wasn't just at a friend's house for the night watching the game, and although she may have been slightly irritated or concerned the night before, this morning she was only concerned, and that concern was growing. Once police were involved, it wasn't long before information began rolling in. Although with all of the information coming to light about the situation, there was only more questions being uncovered and almost no answers. The first pieces of information that became available came from the police. The same day that the report was made, police actually found Lewis's car parked downtown by a courthouse. When the police searched his car, they found all of his keys under the floor mat. Also hidden within the car were David's checkbook, driver's license, and 2 of his credit cards. After police found David's vehicle, they checked his bank activity, and it was at that point when the plot only grew thicker, because his bank activity was strange to say the least. On January 30th, the day after his wife and daughter left town, $5,000 was deposited into his account, but it's unknown who did this and why they did this. And then the next day, the 31st, the day of the Super Bowl, either David or someone using David's card purchased a plane ticket from Amarillo to Dallas, and then another plane ticket was purchased from Los Angeles to Dallas. Both of these plane tickets were in David's name, but it's unconfirmed if either of these plane tickets were used. When the police first brought all of these discoveries to Karen, she was obviously concerned, but little did the police know that Karen had her own bombshell for the police. Karen mentioned to the police that David specifically expressed to Karen that he felt like his life was in danger. Lewis had specifically been a defendant in a lawsuit brought against him and several other lawyers, although after several months of this lawsuit going on, David was the only defendant who has not yet disposed the case. Some people believe that the law firm that David worked for that was being sued by a previous client were pressuring David into giving a disposition that wasn't fully accurate, trying to make him lie about some of the wrongdoings of the law firm that he worked for the benefit of the law firm. Because all of the other lawyers at this law firm had given a disposition and David hadn't, it definitely could have put a target on his back if he was not willing to comply with their less than integral requests of him. For 11 months following the disappearance, even with all of the weird information that they found initially and continued to find, there was absolutely no sign of David anywhere. Not a motive, not a body, not evidence, nothing, literally nothing. And after those 11 months, the official conclusion that the authorities came to on this case was that David must have just left on his own accord and decided to start a new life somewhere else without telling anybody. And undoubtedly, that was a hard pill to swallow for the family. But unfortunately, that was the reality they had to accept. And that alone is crazy and peculiar. If the story ended right there, this would definitely be a story worthy of this video. Somebody disappearing without a trace who seemed to have been home hours ago is just mind-boggling. But the story doesn't end here at all, because 10 years after the case was closed, a bombshell was dropped on the entire situation. In 2004, just over 10 years after David initially went missing, a bored police officer in Washington state was researching cold cases while on duty. Something this police officer likely did often. And on this specific day, this police officer had stumbled on the case of David Glenn Lewis. At first, the story was like many others that he read, but what caught his attention was the photo associated with this missing person. This police officer took one look at David and realized that this was somebody that he had not only seen before, but this was a man that he had found dead 10 years ago. This person that he had found dead in 1993 was actually a hit-and-run case. And because he was so sure that he had seen this man before, he did a bit more digging and tried to line up the dates. And he was able to confirm that the man that he had found dead, he had found only a day after David Lewis was reported missing, meaning that the timelines added up and he had some further digging to do. This is where things get even more strange, because the person this police officer found in Washington state in this hit and run case, although he looked like David Lewis, he didn't have any identification of being David Lewis. He was an unknown person wearing military fatigues walking down the side of the highway with no ID and no personal belongings at all. And unfortunately, he was struck by a vehicle and left for dead, which is where the police officer eventually found him. But even though this police officer was certain that these people looked the exact same, and the dates kind of lined up. How could he be sure that these two people were the same person? After all, this hit and run case took place 1,600 miles from where David Lewis supposedly disappeared from. And although there was plane tickets on David Lewis's credit cards, none of them involved Washington State. So the only way this police officer could know for certain was by getting a DNA test done, which after some time and some convincing, he was able to have the DNA test performed. And the results from that test confirmed that this unnamed man that was found dead on the side of the road on February 1st, 1993 in Washington State was indeed David Glenn Lewis, who was only a night earlier watching the Super Bowl in the comfort of his own home. Nobody knows why David was in Washington State, a place where he had no friends, no family, no connections. Nobody even knows how he got to Washington State. His own personal vehicle was at the courthouse. He was wearing military fatigues that weren't his. And nobody even knows why he even left his couch, let alone the state. So like I mentioned, even though a decade after this disappearance happened, his body was found and confirmed, nothing about this mystery is solved whatsoever, and no substantial evidence up until today has been discovered. Even with this discovery, even though David specifically claimed that he believed his life was in danger, it is officially believed that David simply got up and decided to leave on his own accord, and there was no foul play whatsoever. And for the families, I truly feel for them, because I can't imagine how disheartening it is to have that official conclusion be the case when obviously something was going on here. But unfortunately, this story and the other two we spoke about all have the same ending. No truth is officially known. The causes, the motivations, the truth about what actually happened is still a mystery. You wake up to the sound of a horse-drawn buggy galloping down a cobblestone road. This is a familiar sound. Every morning, the coroners come and collect all of the dead and take them to a burn pile. Today's pile is particularly large. You take a deep breath and reluctantly get out of bed. Today is like any other. You skip breakfast and get straight to work because there is no time to spare. You start by getting dressed. You open your closet and are met with your alter ego, the plague doctor, and for many, the last thing they see before death. You begin by putting on long undergarments tucked into each other, long johns tucked into socks, undershirt tucked into pants, anything to keep out the bad air. Next, you put on a thick, ankle-length overcoat, which has been sealed with animal fat and pleasantly scented wax to prevent any air from seeping in. Next, you put on your boots and gloves, making sure they maintain a tight seal. Following that, you put on your bird-like beak mask. Every morning, you empty the beak and refill it. This beak serves a very important purpose. It was believed that the spread of the plague was caused by bad air, particularly bad smells. Therefore, the thought was, if you could maintain good smells near your nose, you would be protected. The beak had 2 nostrils at the very end of it and was filled with herbs and spices, particularly lavender. The freshly stuffed beak served as a perfect filtration system, or so they thought. The beak is tightly fastened to your face, making sure to prevent any ways for bad air to leak in. Finally, you put on your leather hat and grab your cane, which will be proving very useful very shortly. Now that you're fully equipped, you grab your medical tool bag and you're out the door. You live in an area that's relatively untouched by the plague, at least comparatively speaking, but you work day in and day out in the most devastated parts. Plague doctors were hired by cities to help provide services to low-income citizens who weren't able to pay for proper care, and unfortunately, that typically meant you were dealing with the worst cases possible. These slummish conditions of these poverty-stricken neighborhoods allowed disease to run wild and destroy almost everything in its path. You approach your first house call, checking up on a patient you visited the day before. Before you could even get to this person's door, you are met with a disgruntled and obviously sickly person, desperate for answers and help. This is where one of the use cases of this cane comes in. Tensions were reasonably high, and unfortunately for many people, proper care was simply not an option. People were desperate to get any time or attention they could from the plague doctors, even if that meant assaulting them. It sounds counterintuitive, but people were desperate. You are literally beating people off with a stick to maintain a distance between yourself and people who will likely be dead within the next few days. You enter the residence of your first house call and things are looking grim. Your patient has buboes all over their neck, arms, and legs. These buboes are the inflammation of the lymph nodes, causing large blood and pus-filled boils to appear all over the patient's body. These painful buboes also burst and leave open, oozing wounds. You use your cane again for its second purpose, checking if your patient is even alive. You maintain your distance and nudge them a few times. In this case, your patient wakes up, but only barely. Almost all of the information available is anecdotal, and your tool bag is light and unequipped. For this specific patient, you recommend bloodletting. You open a jar of leeches and start placing the leeches on the buboes to help drain them. As these leeches are applied, you hand this patient a bouquet of flowers to allow them to smell good air. After a roughly 30-minute treatment, you let them know that you don't believe they'll be alive by morning. In this case, you do take a will and last testament from them, something that you'll be able to provide to any of their living family. You pack up your things and you're back onto the street. It's cold, gloomy, and the street is only populated with rats feeding off dead bodies and the smell of death. Although helping people is your only goal, typically even the sight of you was a bad omen. Many people only saw plague doctors days before death, and therefore associated seeing you with dying in the near future. On your walks between house calls, you always ponder on what could be causing such a disease. You know this isn't the first plague, not by a long shot. From the plague of Justinian to the Black Death that eliminated almost a third of Europe, to now, with the resurgence of the plague in Venice, we still have very limited information about what is happening. At this point, the government has tried quarantining the sick and those who even appear to potentially be sick, putting them on a remote island and burning all of their earthly belongings to make sure that there is nothing left to spread the disease. It seems like every day the death count only rises and rises, and those who become infected by the disease live a horrible last few days. The disease starts with the appearance of these buboes, which is typically a mark of death. These buboes multiply in numbers and grow in size, sometimes getting as large as an apple. Hours or potentially even days later, you are met with an extreme fever and a throat-scratching cough. Your body rejects all foods and liquids, and sometimes dehydration would kill you before the plague could. This disease can be so fast-acting that someone can go to bed feeling relatively fine and not wake up in the morning. Before germ theory was ever a thing, miasma theory was the prominent scholarly belief. The theory was simple and refers to the bad air I mentioned earlier. The miasma theory stated that diseases such as the plague were spread through bad air or night air, or essentially noxious gas, meaning that it was the smell that carried the disease and nothing else, which is why the plague doctors kept good smells, perfumes, and spices and herbs in their mask, as the good smells would counteract the bad smells, which unfortunately wasn't extremely effective. It's also for this reason why your thick coat is covered in animal fats and scented wax. You arrive at your next house call, but this patient is no longer with you. But you knew that going into it. You're not treating this person, you're performing an autopsy. On top of treating people, witnessing and writing wills and testaments, plague doctors also performed autopsies when requested to collect information about cause of death and the disease itself. In this case, you're documenting the body of this victim and checking their insides to see what exactly was affected by the plague. This is one of the most dangerous actions for plague doctors, as this presents them with the highest opportunity to get infected bodily fluids on their clothing and on their skin, which could easily infect and kill the doctor. Those who became infected with the plague died within 3 to 8 days, and the death rate of the plague was 80%, meaning that this disease for most people was a death sentence. The deadliness of this disease was actually part of its downfall, as although it was spread through unhygienic, tightly packed urban areas, due to the fact that it killed so quickly, it got to a point where it started running out of victims and started killing itself off as it was unable to find and spread itself to other hosts. Near the end of the plague, people began to understand that transmission occurred when people were in contact with each other. Therefore, quarantining and maintaining distance from others became much more popular. It wasn't known at the time, but the biggest spread of the disease was through infected fleas that lived on rats. Rats that also populated these urban areas heavily. The word quarantine actually comes from the word quarantino, which means 40 days in Italian. This is because when boats would dock at the ports of Italy, they would make these sailors stay on their boat for 40 days to ensure that they were not bringing any disease with them. It's interesting to retrospectively look back at the practices of the time, but unfortunately, when you're in the middle of this situation, tensions were high and information was limited. Some people believe that this plague was a punishment from God, and people took this belief into their own hands and began killing people that they thought to be sinful to help end the plague early by removing the sinful from this world. The psyche of the general population was at an all-time low. When you wake up every day to bodies being carried in front of your house, being brought to burn piles, seeing people covered in awful lumps all over their body, and having a third of your family pass away overnight, you simply can't maintain a normal mind. As a doctor and hired professional, you do your best, but even for you, it's not easy. You finish your day, getting home late, making yourself a meal and resting, as you have another busy day tomorrow, doing all the same things over and over again, hoping that the number of deaths doesn't increase too much, and hoping that you didn't get infected yourself. This same cycle continues over the next years and years until signs of hope start to glimmer, with so many people dying that it's simply harder for the disease to spread. With increased quarantine measures and increased awareness about hygiene in the mind of the population, it appears that the disease is starting to lift, and potentially things are starting to look better. You may be out of the job, but you're completely happy about that because your job requires hell, and you'd rather be retired in heaven than employed in hell. The government relieves you from your duties and you go back to your home in the countryside, finally reconnecting with your wife and children after years of no contact, because even sending a letter could potentially spread the disease as bad air could be trapped in the envelope. You arrive in the countryside to a wife who's breaking down at the sight of you and kids who barely recognize you. You all share a pleasant moment and then go inside. Your wife prepares you a beautiful meal for your return, and your children just want to know who you are and where their dad has been. You have the best day that you've ever had in your life, and you feel that maybe this endless nightmare is over. You tuck your young children into bed for the first time in years, and before going to bed yourself, you go to the washroom. And by washroom, I mean you step outside to take a leak. You unzip your pants and urinate into the vegetable garden you didn't realize your wife planted there. You give yourself a few shakes and realize something on your leg. It's a small lump on your inner groin. It's unfortunately something you're familiar with, and now the timer is ticking.